Hello everyone, and welcome back to Midnight Horror. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the video. Story 1. I pulled off the highway after hours of driving through the desolate stretch of road that seemed to go on forever. The sun had set, and the only lights in sight were the dim, flickering neon of a roadside motel. It was one of those places you barely notice until you're already pulling into the gravel lot. My eyes were heavy, and I needed to rest, so I decided to check in and hope for a decent night's sleep. The receptionist was an older man, his face creased with years of experience in the business. He handed me a key with a small plastic tag that read Room 7, his eyes lingering on mine a little too long as if measuring something, but he didn't say a word. I took the key from him with a polite smile, but a sense of unease had already begun to creep up my spine. The building looked like it had seen better days: faded paint, chipped window frames, and a faint smell of mildew hanging in the air. When I got to the room, it felt just as run down as the exterior. The bed was covered in a thick quilt that looked older than I was, and the curtains were drawn tight, blocking any view of the outside world. A faint hum of the air conditioning unit was the only sound in the room, and the smell of stale air mixed with something else, something unfamiliar. As I dropped my bag onto the bed and turned on the light, I noticed the bathroom door slightly ajar. I pushed the door open, not expecting much. The bathroom was small, with cracked tiles and an old bathtub that seemed to have seen more than its fair share of use. The mirror above the sink was fogged, except for one section right in the center. There was a note taped to the glass. It was yellowed with age, and the handwriting was a messy scrawl that looked hurried. The note read, "Don't sleep in this room." My heart skipped a beat. At first I thought it was a prank, maybe left by a previous guest. But the words on the paper seemed too urgent, too sincere, to be just a joke. I stood there, staring at the note for what felt like an eternity. Who would leave a note like that, and why? The air around me seemed to thicken as I processed what I was seeing. My first instinct was to leave, to grab my things and drive away, but exhaustion held me in place. I had been on the road for hours, and the thought of driving again in the dark made my stomach churn. I had to convince myself that it was just a harmless joke, maybe a message from someone who had been as tired as I was. But then, something strange happened. I felt an odd chill in the air, despite the warmth of the room. I glanced around, expecting to see a draft, but the windows were closed, and the air conditioning hummed softly in the corner. The feeling of being watched crept up on me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that it was just my overactive imagination. I moved away from the mirror, but my eyes kept returning to the note, as if it were calling me back. I felt the urge to leave, to pack my things and get in the car. But again, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Something in my gut told me that if I stayed, I would regret it, but leaving felt just as wrong. The room seemed to be holding me hostage in some way, its stale air pressing in on me. The minutes stretched into hours as I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to ignore the growing anxiety that clawed at my chest. I tried to focus on the television, but the static-filled screen offered no distraction. Each time I glanced toward the bathroom, the note seemed to grow more unsettling. My mind raced with questions: who left it? Why? And most importantly, what was I missing? Eventually, I decided to take a shower, hoping that the routine of washing away the road grime would calm my nerves. But when I stepped into the bathroom, I was struck by the sight of the mirror once again. The note was still there, exactly where I had left it, but something had changed. The handwriting, once messy and rushed, was now neat, deliberate, as if someone had carefully rewritten it. "Leave, before it's too late." My heart raced as I stumbled backward, my breath shallow and fast. I scanned the room, but there was no sign of anyone. The door was still closed, and the silence of the motel pressed in on me like a weight. I had to leave. I couldn't stay in a room that felt like it was closing in on me. I grabbed my bag in a panic, hurling it toward the door. But before I could open it, I heard a soft knock almost imperceptible on the bathroom door. My heart stopped in my chest. I froze, too terrified to move or speak, the sound echoing in my mind. Knock, knock, knock. I stood there paralyzed, staring at the bathroom door as the seconds ticked by. The knock came again, this time louder, more deliberate. My pulse thundered in my ears as I fought the urge to scream, to run. But my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't look away from the door. Just as I mustered the courage to open the door and confront whatever was on the other side, I heard the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Soft at first, but then louder, growing closer to my door. My mind was spinning, caught between the overwhelming urge to flee and the paralyzing fear that I might not make it out in time. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest as I ran down the hallway. I didn't look back, didn't even pause to glance at the receptionist, who was now standing behind the desk, staring at me. I burst out of the motel and into the cool night air, my breath ragged as I scrambled for my car. I didn't stop driving until I was far away from that motel. The note still burned in my mind, the handwriting seared into my memory. But no matter how many times I tried to forget, the question lingered: who had left it? And more importantly, what had they been trying to warn me about? Story 2. The sun was high as I trudged deeper into the forest, a dense canopy of trees casting shadows that seemed to swallow the light. I had been hiking for hours, lost in the rhythm of my footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. The trail was barely visible in places, overtaken by wild grass and creeping vines, but I didn't mind. The solitude was what I was after, a break from the noise of the world, a moment to breathe and let my thoughts settle. As I ventured farther from the marked trail, the forest seemed to grow quieter, the sounds of wildlife fading into the background. The air grew cooler, damp with the scent of earth and moss. I had come this far, and I wasn't about to turn back now. My boots crunched through the underbrush, and I was about to step over a large fallen log when I noticed something unusual. A rusted car. It sat half hidden among the trees, its once bright paint now faded and chipped, its metal body covered in layers of moss and dirt. The driver's door was wide open, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had stumbled upon a forgotten relic from years ago. But as I walked closer, something about the scene struck me as odd. The car didn't look like it had been abandoned long. It wasn't overgrown with vines, as you might expect, and the door seemed almost too deliberately ajar, as if someone had left it that way on purpose. I approached cautiously, my eyes scanning the interior. The car was old, a model from the 70s, maybe even earlier, with a worn-out leather seat and a cracked dashboard. But what stood out the most was the set of keys still dangling from the ignition. I froze for a moment, trying to make sense of it. Why would someone leave a car like this, deep in the forest, with the keys still inside? It didn't make any sense. I reached out slowly, the metal cold to the touch, and pulled the door open wider. A faint smell of stale air and dust drifted out. Inside, the seats were torn and faded, but there was no sign of any belongings or personal items. No bags, no trash, no indication that anyone had lived or spent any significant amount of time in the car. Just emptiness. It was as if the driver had simply vanished. I glanced at the keys again, still dangling from the ignition. My heart beat a little faster. There was something unsettling about it, the idea that someone had just left the car here in the middle of nowhere without a word or a sign of where they had gone. It felt like a scene pulled from a mystery novel, too strange to ignore. Curiosity tugged at me, and against my better judgment, I opened the door and slid into the driver's seat. The worn leather creaked beneath my weight, and I hesitated for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel. The forest around me was eerily still, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air felt thick, heavy, like something was lurking just beyond my line of sight. I tried to start the car, just to see if it would even turn over. I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine sputtered to life with a cough, but it didn't sound healthy. The car groaned, its engine misfiring, as if it had been left to rot for far longer than I had imagined. The dashboard lights flickered, casting an odd glow inside the car, and the faint smell of gasoline filled the air. I quickly turned the key back off, my pulse quickening. It was as if the car had been waiting for someone to try it, as if it had been dormant all this time, only to come to life when I touched it. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I glanced nervously over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees behind me. But there was nothing, just the rustling of the leaves and the distant sound of wind. I sat there for a moment, trying to calm myself, trying to make sense of the strange feeling gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. I needed to leave. There was no reason to stay in the forest any longer, especially not after finding a car like this. Something about it didn't sit right with me. The keys, the open door, the faint smell of gasoline, it all felt wrong. As I reached to open the door, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt near the car. They were fresh, too, the kind of tracks that suggested someone had been here recently. The prints were large, and they led into the trees, disappearing into the thick undergrowth. My stomach churned as I realized I wasn't alone, not anymore. Someone had left this car, but where had they gone? I stepped out of the car, my mind racing as I followed the footprints. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked, the air growing colder with each step. The prints led me deeper into the woods, weaving between the trees in a pattern that didn't quite make sense. They weren't perfectly aligned, as if the person who made them had been walking erratically, almost stumbling. I followed the tracks for a while, the sound of my footsteps crunching in the underbrush, the only noise in the otherwise silent forest. The deeper I went, the more unsettled I became. I had no idea how far I had wandered, but the further I walked, the more the air seemed to shift. The trees grew thicker, and the sounds of the forest grew quieter. It felt like I was being drawn in, as if something was guiding me, pulling me forward. Eventually, the footprints stopped. I found myself standing in a small clearing, the trees forming a tight circle around me. The air here was unnaturally still, the silence deafening. There were no more tracks, no sign of the person who had been walking here. But then I saw something. In the center of the clearing, half buried in the dirt, was a small, rusted object. I kneeled down to examine it, my fingers trembling as I brushed away the dirt. It was a ring, old and worn, with a faint engraving on the inside. My heart sank as I read the inscription, "Always with you." A sudden chill ran down my spine, and I heard a crack in the distance, the unmistakable sound of twigs breaking underfoot. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. The clearing was empty. There was no one there, but the feeling that I was being watched grew stronger. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to leave. Whatever had happened here, whatever had caused this car to be abandoned in the forest, I didn't want to be a part of it. I turned and ran, not looking back, my footsteps pounding against the dirt as I made my way out of the forest. the feeling of being followed lingering just beyond my reach. Story 3. I had been looking forward to my getaway for weeks, a cabin in the mountains, far away from the noise of city life. The drive up was beautiful, with winding roads flanked by towering trees and the air growing cooler with every mile. The cabin itself was small but cozy, nestled in a secluded valley with a stunning view of the surrounding peaks. I arrived just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the landscape. The first night was peaceful, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. I settled in quickly, bolting the door behind me as I unpacked my things. The place felt old, but in a comforting way, like a relic of a simpler time. I could almost feel the history in the wooden walls, the smell of pine in the air mixing with the faint scent of old books and dust. I sat down in front of the fireplace, enjoying the warmth as the fire crackled. Before bed, I made sure to check the door once more. It was sturdy, old but solid, with a large bolt lock that slid easily into place. I always made it a point to lock everything when staying in a new place, and the cabin was no exception. The quiet was soothing, and I quickly drifted off to sleep, unaware of the strange events that would soon unfold. The next morning, I woke to the smell of fresh pine and crisp mountain air. As I stretched and got out of bed, something felt off. The usual tranquility was there, but there was a slight unease, a nagging feeling that I couldn't shake. When I walked into the living room and saw the front door wide open, my heart skipped a beat. I froze in the doorway. The door I had bolted shut the night before. The latch was undone, the door hanging slightly ajar. I couldn't believe it. I was sure I had locked it before going to bed. I was always careful about such things, especially in remote places like this. I stepped forward cautiously and examined the lock. It seemed fine, undisturbed, but the door itself clearly hadn't been locked. I checked the rest of the cabin, my mind racing with possibilities. Had someone entered during the night? Had I somehow forgotten to lock it? But everything inside the cabin was just as I had left it. Nothing was out of place. No signs of anyone having been inside. I closed the door, bolted it again, and tried to shrug off the feeling of unease that had crept over me. The next night, I was extra vigilant. I made sure the door was securely bolted before heading to bed, double-checking the lock. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the thought of someone being in the cabin while I slept made me uneasy. The wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, providing a semblance of comfort. I drifted off to sleep, but this time, the sense of unease followed me into my dreams. The next morning I woke to the same sight. The front door was once again wide open. My pulse quickened, and my hands shook as I stood there, staring at the door. I couldn't fathom what was happening. There was no way I could have forgotten to lock it. I checked the lock again, perfectly fine. The door had been bolted, but the door was open. I stepped outside, looking around. The mountain air was fresh, and the only sounds were the calls of birds and the rustle of the trees in the breeze. I didn't see anything unusual, but the feeling that something wasn't right gnawed at me. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. Maybe I was just overthinking things, letting the isolation get to me. As I walked along the narrow trail that wound through the trees, I tried to shake off the unease. The forest was beautiful, peaceful, a perfect place for solitude. But something about the cabin kept nagging at me. When I returned, the door was once again locked, as I had left it. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder as I entered. The quiet seemed too quiet, the trees just a little too still. The next night, I barely slept at all. The sounds of the night seemed amplified in the stillness. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside made me jump. I kept thinking I heard someone walking outside, or maybe just the whisper of footsteps. But each time I looked out the window, there was nothing. I bolted the door again, but my mind was racing with possibilities. Morning came, but this time, when I opened my eyes, the door was shut. I sighed in relief, grateful that it hadn't opened again. Maybe I was just paranoid. Maybe it was the wind or my mind playing tricks on me. But as I stepped into the living room, I noticed something strange. There was a faint, muddy footprint on the floor, just inside the doorway. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the mark. I hadn't noticed it before. The door had been locked. How could there be a footprint? I knelt down, tracing the edge of the print with my finger. It was small, almost child-sized. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't alone. I spent the rest of the day trying to keep my mind occupied. I went on long hikes, explored the nearby lake, but no matter where I went, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I returned to the cabin that evening, I found the door locked again. But as I stepped inside, the smell of something faintly sweet and sour filled the air. It was subtle, like the scent of old flowers or something left to decay. I didn't know how much more of this I could take. The isolation, the strange occurrences, it was all beginning to wear on me. That night, I decided I would leave the cabin early in the morning. I couldn't stay there any longer, not knowing who or what was opening the door every night. But when I woke the next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. The door was locked, just as I had left it. But the bolt had been replaced with something else, a small, wooden carving of a figure, its face twisted in a grotesque smile. It was placed carefully in the spot where the bolt should have been. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that it was time to leave. I packed my things quickly, my hands shaking, and fled from the cabin, leaving the mountain behind. Story 4. The old orphanage stood at the edge of town, a crumbling relic of a bygone era. It had been abandoned for years, the windows boarded up and the doors sealed shut. I had always been drawn to the place, fascinated by its eerie reputation and the whispers that circulated about its dark history. One afternoon, driven by curiosity and the thrill of exploration, I decided to break in and see for myself what lay inside. The building was colder than I expected, the air thick with dust and the scent of mildew. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating peeling wallpaper and broken furniture scattered across the floor. It was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. The walls seemed to close in as I moved through the rooms, my footsteps echoing off the hollow floors. I made my way down a narrow hallway, my breath fogging in the chilly air. As I passed one of the doorways, I caught sight of something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A row of beds, all neatly made. The sheets were crisp, the pillows fluffed, as if the children had just left them moments ago. It was impossible. No one had lived here for years, and yet the beds looked as though they were in use. I stepped closer, my heart thudding in my chest. The beds were arranged in neat rows, each one identical to the others. There were no signs of wear or decay. Everything was immaculate, untouched by time. I reached out and touched the nearest bed frame, the metal cool under my fingers. The air felt heavy, as though the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The walls were adorned with faded posters of happy children, their faces smiling in contrast to the desolation around them. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was intruding on something I wasn't meant to see. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran down my spine as I turned to leave. But just as I reached for the door, I heard a soft rustling noise from the far end of the room. My heart skipped a beat. I turned, my flashlight flickering in my hand. The beds were still there, unchanged, but the rustling continued. I stepped cautiously toward the sound, my flashlight beam dancing nervously across the room. The noise was faint, like the shifting of fabric, but it was unmistakable. Something or someone was there. I held my breath as I moved closer, the beam of light revealing nothing but empty space. The rustling grew louder, more frantic, as if the bedclothes were being disturbed by an unseen force. My pulse quickened, and I backed away slowly, my mind racing. Was it just the wind? Or was there something else, something far darker, lingering in the shadows? I turned and ran down the hallway, my footsteps thudding against the floor. The sound of rustling followed me, growing louder with each step. I could feel a presence behind me, a weight in the air that pressed against my back. I reached the stairs and bounded down them, the sound of my breathing loud in my ears. The further I went, the more the air seemed to grow thick with unease. I found myself standing in the main foyer, looking around at the decaying walls and rotting floors. The front door was still sealed tight, but the windows had been shattered long ago. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the broken glass, casting strange shadows across the room. I wanted to leave, to run out of this place and never look back, but something kept me there, some pull that I couldn't explain. I turned back toward the hallway, staring at the dark passageway that led deeper into the building. The beds had unsettled me, yes, but there was more to this place than that. I felt an eerie sense of being watched, as though eyes were following my every move. I took a deep breath and walked back toward the rooms, determined to find out more. As I passed the doorway once again, I noticed something that I hadn't seen before, a small, tattered piece of paper sticking out from under one of the beds. I knelt down and carefully pulled it out, holding it up to the light. It was a crumpled letter, the ink faded and barely legible. I could just make out the words, "Don't forget us." A wave of unease washed over me as I read the letter. Who had left this behind, and why? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as I placed the letter back under the bed where I had found it. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the row of neatly made beds, trying to make sense of it all. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I spun around, but there was nothing. The room was still, the beds untouched. I rubbed my eyes, telling myself I was imagining things, but the feeling of being watched never left. It was as if the very walls of the orphanage were alive, observing my every move, waiting for me to make a mistake. I walked slowly to the door, my footsteps light on the floor. The rustling sound returned, faint but persistent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the room was empty. There was no one, no children, no caretakers, no one to explain what was happening. Only the unsettling sense that something was wrong, that this place held secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. I stepped outside into the fading light of day, my mind still spinning with the mystery of the orphanage. The world outside seemed normal, the streets bustling with life, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been marked by what I had seen. The beds, the letter, the rustling, they were all fragments of a past I had no right to uncover. But the truth lingered, like a shadow that followed me wherever I went, reminding me that the orphanage and the children who once lived there were not as forgotten as they seemed. Story 5. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving a faint orange glow that barely lit the deserted highway ahead. I was alone, driving through the stretch of road that seemed to stretch on forever. My headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the cracked asphalt, but there was no other car in sight. The solitude of the road should have been peaceful, but a strange unease began to creep over me as the miles wore on. It had been hours since I passed through the last town. and I was starting to wonder if I had made a mistake by taking this route. The road seemed endless, the occasional sign a reminder of just how far I was from civilization. I glanced at the rearview mirror, and for the first time in a while, something caught my attention: a set of headlights in the distance. I dismissed it at first, figuring it was another car far behind. But as I drove on, I realized the headlights were growing closer, and the car seemed to be matching my speed. I sped up slightly, and so did the car behind me. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, maybe just another traveler on the same lonely road. But when I slowed down, the car behind me slowed down too, keeping the exact distance. My heart rate quickened, a nagging feeling at the back of my mind urging me to do something, anything, to get away from the car that was now tailing me so closely. I swerved slightly, trying to shake it off, but the car mirrored my every move. There were no turns or intersections to lose it in, just a straight road with miles of nothing ahead. The unease in my chest shifted to a kind of terror, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced again in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a shadow or figure in the car behind me, but there was only the gleaming headlights staring back. It was at that moment that I knew something wasn't right. I slammed my foot down on the gas pedal, pushing the car to its limit, desperate to break free of this silent follower. But the headlights remained a constant fixture in my mirror, never faltering, never getting closer, never receding. The road ahead was endless, the sky above empty, and I felt the isolation of it all press in on me. As the miles dragged on, my thoughts grew more frantic. I thought about pulling off the road, stopping and confronting the driver, but a deep instinctual fear told me that would be a mistake. The headlights were still there, the car still following with unyielding precision. My hands gripped the wheel tighter, knuckles white. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, but the fear continued to claw at me. Suddenly, a flicker of an idea struck me. I could pull over just for a second and see what happened. I could confirm that the car wasn't just another traveler on the same road, that it wasn't just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe, just maybe, I could catch a glimpse of the driver. I knew it was risky, but the temptation to know what was going on was stronger than the fear of stopping. I decided to act. With one final glance at the rearview mirror, I slowed the car and veered onto the shoulder, the gravel crunching under the tires as I came to a stop. The headlights of the car behind me seemed to grow brighter as I watched in the mirror. The car didn't stop though. It kept coming, closing the distance with a chilling consistency. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what was happening. The car behind me didn't slow down, it didn't even appear to be stopping. I watched in horror as the headlights passed by, moving alongside me. But there was no sound of the engine, no tires screeching, nothing to indicate that a car was even there. The eerie silence was almost deafening. I leaned forward, squinting into the mirror, my heart racing. The car kept going, continuing down the highway at the same speed, but there was no driver inside. No figure at the wheel. The seat was empty, the steering wheel unmoved, as if the car itself were being driven by some unseen force. My breath came in short gasps as I stared in disbelief, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Without thinking, I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching against the gravel as I backed up quickly. I didn't know what I was doing, only that I needed to get away from this thing. But as I backed up, the car ahead of me, still moving without a driver, seemed to match my movements, keeping the same distance between us. It was as if the car had no intention of letting me go. In a panic, I slammed the car into drive again and sped off, this time not daring to glance back. The headlights were gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. The oppressive silence returned, and the road stretched out before me, darker and more desolate than before. I wasn't sure if I was being followed anymore, or if it was all in my mind, but the gnawing sense of dread didn't fade. The miles blurred by as I drove, but I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights again. They never came, but something else appeared in the distance, a faint, flickering light, like a street lamp in the distance. As I approached, it became clearer, another car, parked on the side of the road. My stomach twisted. I slowed down, but the car was empty. There was no driver, no passengers, just an abandoned vehicle left in the middle of nowhere. I didn't stop. I drove straight past, my hands gripping the wheel so tight it hurt. The darkness outside seemed to close in, the highway feeling narrower, the air thicker with unease. As I drove further into the night, I realized the road had no end. It stretched on forever, and it was impossible to tell where it began or where it would take me. The headlights, those same haunting headlights, were still somewhere in the darkness behind me, watching, waiting, and I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever escape. Story 6. The old church stood on the edge of town, its weathered stone walls and towering spire casting long shadows over the quiet street. It had been abandoned for years, or so I thought. The windows were dark, their once stained glass now cracked and dull, the iron gate rusted shut. Yet there was something strangely inviting about the building, as if it were waiting for someone to step inside and discover its secrets. On a whim, I decided to take a look, drawn by a pull I couldn't quite explain. I pushed open the heavy wooden door, the sound of the hinges groaning in protest. The air inside was thick with dust, and the scent of mildew filled my lungs. Despite the decay, there was a reverence in the space, an eerie kind of peace that lingered, almost tangible. Sunlight filtered through the cracked windows, casting streaks of pale light across the dim interior. My footsteps echoed as I walked down the aisle, the silence pressing in from all sides. The pews were old, their wood darkened by age and neglect. Each one was worn, the once polished surface marred by countless years of use. But as I walked closer, something caught my eye, something that sent a chill crawling up my spine. Across the wooden seats, deep, jagged scratches ran in every direction. The marks were uneven, as if something or someone had clawed at the wood, desperate to escape or perhaps to make its mark. The scratches were long, deep, and fresh-looking, despite the fact that the church had been abandoned for decades. I couldn't understand how they could still appear so vivid, so raw. I reached out to touch one of the marks, my fingers grazing the rough surface. It felt unnaturally smooth, as though the wood had been polished over time. But the scratch itself, it was almost too precise, as if it had been carved deliberately. My skin prickled with unease, and I quickly withdrew my hand. The feeling that I wasn't alone in the church grew stronger, and the weight of the silence seemed to press down harder on my chest. I moved further down the aisle, inspecting each pew more closely. The scratches were not uniform. Some were shallow, while others were deep enough to leave splinters around the edges. They were scattered in no particular pattern, but one thing was clear: these marks weren't the result of normal wear and tear. They looked intentional, as though someone had spent hours, even days, carving them into the seats. The thought of it sent a shudder through me, but I couldn't tear myself away from the mystery. As I walked deeper into the church, I noticed more oddities. The air seemed colder the farther I ventured, and the faint scent of incense lingered in the corners, as though it had been burned long ago. There were no signs of recent human activity, no footprints, no trash, not even the faintest trace of a living presence. Yet the scratches on the pews told a different story. It was as if someone or something had been trapped in this place, leaving their mark on the world with every tortured swipe. I found myself at the altar, staring up at the crumbling structure. The once grand pulpit was now a shadow of its former self, covered in dust and cobwebs. The wooden cross that hung above it was chipped and broken, its once gilded edges dulled by years of neglect. But even in its decrepit state, the altar seemed to hold a certain power, a sense of solemnity that made me hesitate before moving closer. It was then that I heard a faint sound, just a whisper on the edge of my hearing. At first I thought it was the wind, but there was no breeze in the church, and the sound wasn't quite like any wind I had ever heard. It was a soft rustling, as though something or someone was moving just out of sight. My heart rate quickened, and I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. But the church remained empty, its vast interior stretching out before me like an infinite void. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. There was no reason to be afraid, I told myself. The church was abandoned, it was just a building, a relic of the past. But even as I tried to reassure myself, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I couldn't shake the sense that I was not alone. The air felt charged with something I couldn't explain, something ancient and heavy. I turned back to the pews, my eyes drawn once again to the deep scratches. I couldn't stop thinking about them. The longer I stared at the marks, the more it seemed as though they were shifting, rearranging themselves, moving beneath the surface of the wood. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get out before whatever presence lingered in this place grew bolder. But my feet refused to obey. I had to know. I had to understand what had happened here. I knelt beside one of the pews, inspecting the scratches more closely. I noticed something new, something that hadn't been there before. Small, almost imperceptible lines had started to appear around the edges of the scratches, as though they were expanding, spreading like roots beneath the wood. I reached out again, my fingers trembling, and touched one of the new lines. It was as if the wood had become alive, pulsating beneath my fingertips. Before I could pull my hand away, a loud bang echoed through the church. My heart skipped a beat, and I jerked my hand back in fright. The sound came from the far side of the room, near the entrance. I could hear footsteps now, heavy and slow, dragging across the floor. But when I looked, the church was still empty. The scratches on the pews began to grow more pronounced, their jagged edges seeming to lengthen and deepen before my eyes. The air became thick with the scent of incense, now overpowering, choking me with its intensity. I stood up, my breath shallow, my hands clammy. I needed to leave. I needed to get out. As I turned to make my way toward the door, I heard a voice, low and rasping, coming from the far corner of the church. It was a whisper, but it felt like it was right next to me in my ear, breathing down my neck. "Help me." The words were barely audible, but they sent a wave of terror through my body. I didn't look back. I ran, my feet pounding against the worn wooden floors, until I burst through the door and into the daylight. The church was quiet behind me, its dark secrets hidden once more, but I couldn't shake the image of those deep, jagged scratches on the pews, as if they had been made by something desperate, something trapped in the church, trying to break free. The feeling of being watched never left me, and I knew one thing for certain: whatever had happened in that church was far from over. Story 7. The lighthouse stood like a forgotten sentinel at the edge of the cliffs, its whitewashed stone cracked and weathered by decades of salt and wind. I had come out to the coast for a weekend getaway, drawn by the promise of solitude and a unique experience. The lighthouse, abandoned for years, had been converted into a small bed and breakfast of sorts, offering a place for those looking for a little peace and quiet far from the bustle of the city. I had always been fascinated by lighthouses and their eerie, isolated beauty, and this one seemed to call out to me. When I arrived, the caretaker, an older man with graying hair and a weathered face, greeted me at the door. He handed me the key to the lighthouse and gave me a quick tour of the place. The interior was just as worn as the exterior, with creaky floors and a musty smell that lingered in the air. But there was a charm to it, a history in the walls that made it feel like a place suspended in time. He mentioned the foghorn briefly, noting that it hadn't worked for years, a casualty of the lighthouse's disuse. After settling into my room, I gazed out at the rolling fog that had begun to settle over the coastline. The view from the lighthouse was breathtaking, vast stretches of ocean stretching into the horizon, the jagged cliffs below, and the thick fog that seemed to have swallowed the land whole. The silence was profound, broken only by the distant crash of waves against the rocks far below. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel small and insignificant in the vastness of nature. As night fell, the fog thickened even more, wrapping the lighthouse in a heavy, suffocating embrace. I sat by the window with a book in my hand, but my eyes kept drifting toward the dark sea. The sound of the waves was constant, but it seemed to fade into the background of my awareness, leaving me with a strange sense of unease. There was something unsettling about being so far out on the cliffs, surrounded by nothing but fog and ocean. The foghorn blared, the low, mournful sound cutting through the air. I froze, the sound vibrating through the floorboards beneath me. It was strange, it shouldn't have been working. The caretaker had told me the power had been disconnected years ago. I put my book down, confused and slightly unnerved. The sound continued, persistent and steady, like a heartbeat in the stillness of the night. I walked out into the narrow hallway, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. The foghorn was unmistakable. It was coming from the lighthouse itself, from the large, rusted mechanism at the top of the tower. I had seen it earlier during the tour, but it had looked more like an abandoned relic, nothing more than an old piece of equipment left to rot in the salt air. How could it be working? It shouldn't have been possible. I made my way up the spiral staircase, each step creaking beneath my weight. The foghorn sound seemed to grow louder as I climbed, echoing in the narrow stairwell. It felt like the very walls of the lighthouse were vibrating in time with the noise. By the time I reached the top, I was breathless, my pulse quickening with every step. The door to the foghorn room was ajar, and I pushed it open. Inside, the machinery looked untouched, just as I had seen it during the tour, rusted, ancient, and disconnected. There was no electricity, no power running to the foghorn, but it was blaring as though it was alive. The deep, hollow sound reverberated through the space, and I could feel it in my chest. My mind raced to make sense of it, but nothing seemed to fit. How could this be happening? I leaned closer to the machinery, inspecting it with growing anxiety. The foghorn was positioned above a massive lens, a beacon that once guided ships through dangerous waters. But now it seemed almost like a ghost haunting the space with its mournful cry. I reached out a hand to touch it, the metal cold beneath my fingertips, but just as I did, the sound abruptly stopped. Silence filled the room, and for a moment I could hear nothing but my own breath. I stood there for a moment, my mind whirling. What in the world was going on? There had been no electricity, no power source, yet the foghorn had been blaring as though it were still functioning. I slowly backed away from the machinery, my eyes darting around the room. There was no rational explanation for what I had just experienced. I made my way back down the stairs, the silence now overwhelming after the blaring foghorn. When I reached my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm my racing heart. Had I imagined it? Was it just the isolation getting to me, making me hear things? But I knew what I had heard. It had been real, too real. The clock on the nightstand showed that it was past midnight. I tried to distract myself reading a few pages of my book, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The foghorn sound still echoed in my mind, a constant thrum in the back of my thoughts. It wasn't just a mechanical noise, it felt alive. And then, just as I began to relax, the foghorn blared again. The sound filled the room, rattling the windows, shaking the walls. I jumped to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. This time it was even louder, more urgent. I couldn't ignore it. And I grabbed my coat and hurried out of the room, my feet moving without thought as I made my way back to the lighthouse tower. As I reached the door to the foghorn room, it slammed shut in front of me, as if something had blocked it from the inside. I pushed against it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. The foghorn's wail reached a fever pitch, and I could feel the walls vibrating with the intensity of it. And then, the light at the top of the lighthouse flickered on. The beam swept across the fog, cutting through it like a knife. I stood there, frozen, unable to move, staring at the light as it swept across the ocean. It was impossible. The power had been disconnected years ago. There was no way it should have been working. But there it was. The light. The foghorn. The lighthouse. And I knew in that moment that I was no longer alone. Story 8. The wind carried the scent of rust and decay as I wandered through the overgrown gates of the abandoned amusement park. I had heard about this place from locals, how it had been shut down years ago after an accident and left to rot under the weight of time. Curiosity led me here, the promise of exploring forgotten rides and structures too tempting to resist. The entrance was cracked and chipped, the paint peeling off the iron gates, but I managed to squeeze through without much trouble. The park was eerily quiet, save for the sound of my footsteps crunching over the dried leaves and broken asphalt. The once vibrant colors of the rides had long faded into dull shades of gray and brown. The carnival games, too, stood still, their prizes faded and forgotten, scattered on the ground like remnants of a dream. The Ferris wheel loomed in the distance, its skeletal frame towering above the rest of the park like a ghost from another era. I made my way toward the Ferris wheel, fascinated by how it seemed to dominate the landscape. It had always been the centerpiece of the park, with its once gleaming carriages now rusted and lifeless. The towering wheel stood like a sentinel, unmoving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The whole park felt alive in a way that was hard to explain. The wind howled through the empty spaces, but there was something more subtle hum that lingered in the air, almost imperceptible, but ever present. As I approached the base of the Ferris wheel, I noticed how the metal supports had corroded over time, the once sturdy structure now fragile and worn. It seemed as though the wheel had been frozen in time, a monument to the past. I leaned against one of the rusted poles, peering up at the creaking wheel, imagining what it must have been like when the park was alive with laughter and joy. But as I stood there, something strange happened. At first, it was just a faint movement, a twitch, a shudder in the frame of the Ferris wheel. Then, slowly, the wheel began to turn. The rusted gears groaned, the metal creaked, but there was no mistaking it. The Ferris wheel was moving. My heart skipped a beat as I watched it begin to rotate, one slow turn after another. I stepped back, unsure whether I should be frightened or fascinated. The wheel turned slowly at first, as if testing the strength of its old structure. The carriages creaked as they swayed, their chains rattling in the still air. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. There was no wind, no sign of any machinery in motion. Yet the Ferris wheel continued its steady turn, gaining speed with each revolution. A chill ran down my spine as I watched the carriages rise higher into the air, their paint peeling away in the breeze. It was as if the park had suddenly come to life, breathing once more after years of silence. The hum I had noticed earlier seemed to intensify, resonating in my chest as the Ferris wheel continued to turn. Faster now, its metal frame shaking with the force of the movement. I stepped back further, my feet suddenly feeling heavy as though the ground beneath me was shifting. The sound of the wheel's movement filled the park, a cacophony of metal scraping against metal, but there was no one around. Just me standing in the middle of an abandoned amusement park, watching a ride that had been dormant for decades spin wildly on its own. My pulse quickened, and I found myself unable to tear my gaze away from the eerie scene unfolding before me. The wind picked up, swirling around me in strange, unpredictable gusts, tugging at my clothes. The Ferris wheel's speed continued to increase, the squeal of the metal scraping against itself becoming deafening. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise, the sensation of being watched creeping over me. There was something in the air, something that felt wrong, but I couldn't look away. The wheel was alive, and it wanted to spin. My heart raced as I backed away from the wheel, my instincts screaming at me to run. I glanced around, half expecting to see anyone else in the park, but there was no one. Just the wheel, turning faster and faster, as if mocking me for my hesitation. The carriages were now flying through the air, the rusted metal screeching as they swung wildly in circles. The hum had grown louder, more insistent, and I could feel the vibrations through my feet, through my body. I turned and began to walk briskly away from the Ferris wheel, my breath coming in short, panic bursts. But the sound of the wheel's movement seemed to follow me, its eerie hum lingering in the air like a warning. I glanced back one last time, my eyes wide with disbelief. The Ferris wheel was still spinning, faster now, almost blurring in its motion. It was as though it was reaching out, begging for someone to ride it, someone to finish the journey it had started so long ago. I reached the edge of the park, my heart still pounding in my chest. The Ferris wheel's revolutions were slowing now, coming to a gradual halt as if it expended all of its energy. The creaking noises began to fade, the hum dissipating into the silence of the abandoned park. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to process what I had just witnessed. It took me several minutes to gather the courage to turn and leave. The wind had settled, and the park was silent once again. The Ferris wheel stood still, its towering frame now just a monument to time. But I knew, deep in my bones, that it wasn't the end. Whatever force had made it move, it was still there, lurking in the shadows of the forgotten park. Story 9. I had always been fascinated by abandoned places, and old hospitals with their eerie atmosphere and forgotten histories held a particular allure for me. The one I was exploring that day had been closed for decades, its once bustling halls now eerily silent. The paint on the walls was peeling, and the windows were shattered or boarded up, leaving the entire building cloaked in a dull, gray light. I had heard rumors about this hospital, about strange occurrences, missing records, and the inexplicable way it had shut down so suddenly, but I never took them seriously. I was here for the thrill of discovery, for the stories the building might tell me if I dared to listen. The air inside the hospital was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The long, empty hallways stretched out before me, and every step I took echoed through the abandoned building. It felt like I was walking through time, like every room, every hallway held memories of lives once lived. I could almost hear the faint sounds of distant voices, the hum of machines, and the shuffle of feet, but it was all just a trick of the mind, nothing more than the building's ghostly whispers. As I explored further, I stumbled upon an old nurse's station, The desk was covered in papers, all yellowed with age, some of them crinkled and torn. It was as though the place had been abandoned in the middle of its workday, frozen in time. I sifted through the papers, not expecting to find much. But there was one thing that caught my attention: a small white plastic wristband wedged between some old patient files. The name on it made my heart skip a beat. It was my name. I stood still for a moment, staring at the wristband as if it were some kind of optical illusion. My name, engraved in bold black letters, was written clearly across the front. Below it, the date was stamped tomorrow's date. I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine, and I instinctively looked around the room as if the answer to this strange discovery would be hiding in the corners of the hospital, waiting to explain itself. But nothing was there. The room was as empty as it had been moments before. I swallowed hard, trying to make sense of it. How could a wristband with my name on it be here? It had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe it was someone else with the same name, though that seemed unlikely. But the date, tomorrow, that was what unsettled me the most. There was no logical explanation for why this wristband, seemingly placed here by chance, was dated for the very next day. I took a deep breath and placed the wristband back on the desk, though I didn't feel entirely comfortable leaving it there. Something about it felt like a warning, but I couldn't shake the need to understand more about what was happening. Why was this hospital still here, left in such a state of disrepair? Why had it been abandoned in the first place? And what did this wristband mean? I walked down another hallway, the footsteps of my boots echoing louder than I would have liked. As I passed an old patient room, the door, which had been slightly ajar, creaked open further. I hesitated, but then pushed the door wide. Inside, the room was in near perfect disarray, as if it had been lived in recently. The bed was unmade, the sheets twisted and torn, and medical equipment lay scattered on the floor, abandoned in a hurry. My eyes scanned the room, but what caught my attention was a file folder, lying open on a metal bedside table. I approached it carefully, though the sense of unease that had been gnawing at me only grew stronger with each step. The folder was filled with patient records, most of them dated many years ago, but there, tucked in the back, was a new file. A fresh, unmarked file. I opened it slowly, my fingers trembling, and my eyes went straight to the patient's name. It was mine again. The file contained detailed notes about a supposed treatment, nothing that made sense to me. The pages were filled with medical jargon I didn't understand, but the most disturbing part was the final page. It listed a series of instructions for a procedure scheduled for tomorrow. I felt my blood run cold. What procedure? I had never been to this hospital, let alone been treated here. Yet there it was, my name, the date, and a detailed list of medical actions that were supposed to be performed on me the very next day. I dropped the file in shock, the pages scattering across the floor like a deck of cards. My heart raced as I backed away from the table. The room seemed to close in around me, and the temperature dropped noticeably, leaving a chill in the air. I turned quickly and left the room, my steps quickening as the unease turned into something darker, something I couldn't explain. The air felt heavy now, as though something had shifted in the building. I made my way toward the exit, my mind spinning with questions I didn't have answers to. The wristband, the file, tomorrow. None of it made sense. Why was this hospital still standing, and why was I being linked to it in such a disturbing way? Was it some kind of elaborate prank, a joke at my expense? But everything felt too real for it to be just that. It was as though the hospital itself was alive, aware of my presence, pulling me deeper into its twisted narrative. When I reached the main lobby, I felt the same sense of foreboding wash over me. The doors were locked, and the only way out was through the old emergency exit at the back of the building. I hurried toward it, nearly running, but when I reached the door and pushed it open, I was met with a wall of fog. The air outside was thick and cold, and I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of me. I stepped into the fog, my heart still pounding. I needed to get out of there, but the further I walked, the more I felt like the hospital was following me. It was as if it were trying to keep me there, trying to tie me to something I couldn't understand. I looked down at the wristband in my hand, still cold against my skin, and for the first time, I truly wondered if I would be there tomorrow, if the procedure listed in the file would actually happen, or if I was already caught in something that could never be explained. Story 10. I had always been drawn to the quiet solitude of nature, so when the opportunity to stay at a remote hunting lodge came up, I didn't hesitate. The lodge was nestled deep in the woods, far from any town or main road. The air was crisp, the kind that bites at your skin and leaves you feeling alive, yet it held a stillness that made everything feel suspended in time. I arrived just as dusk was settling, the fading light casting long shadows across the cabin's weathered exterior. Inside, the lodge was just as old as it looked on the outside. The wooden beams creaked with age, and the scent of pine and earth lingered in the air. The fireplace crackled, casting a warm glow over the sparse, rustic furnishings. The bed was an oversized quilt tucked against the wall, and though the place was well kept, it still had that abandoned feel, like no one had truly lived there in years. I tried to shake the odd sense of being watched, but it clung to me like a shadow as I unpacked. That night I settled into bed, the silence of the forest outside wrapping around the lodge like a heavy blanket. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the crackling of the fire in the hearth. My mind wandered back to the times I'd stayed in places like this, but something about the stillness of this particular night unsettled me. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, eventually falling into a deep sleep, though my dreams were filled with strange whispers and distant footsteps. Morning arrived quietly, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the blinds and casting soft shadows across the room. I stretched, yawning, and glanced around. The night had been uneventful, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something had been off. I rolled out of bed, planning to make some coffee and head out to explore the surrounding woods. But when I stood up, my feet sank slightly into the soft carpet and I froze. There, right next to my bed, were muddy footprints, large, heavy prints that led directly from the window to the side of the bed. My heart began to race as I stared at the footprints. They were fresh, the mud still wet and slick, and they were unmistakably human. The strangest part was that they appeared to have come from the direction of the woods, though there was no sign of a trail leading away from the bed. They were thick and deep, as if someone had been walking in heavy boots, but I was sure I hadn't heard any movement during the night. I crouched down, inspecting the tracks closely. The mud had a strange, dark tint to it, almost like it had been mixed with something else, something thick, something I couldn't identify. I stood up quickly, my mind racing. Who could have been outside my window in the middle of the night? I had locked the door before going to sleep, and there was no sign of forced entry. The only explanation I could think of was that perhaps an animal had wandered in, but that didn't make sense either. The prints were too clear, too deliberate to be made by an animal. I scanned the room for anything else out of place, but everything seemed normal, aside from the footprints. Trying to stay calm, I stepped out of the room and into the kitchen, hoping that the bright light and the mundane tasks of making breakfast would help clear my head. I poured some coffee, my hands still trembling slightly, and sat at the small wooden table by the window. The lodge was quiet, but outside, I could see the woods stretching out endlessly, trees standing tall like silent sentinels. I found myself wondering if it had been a trick of the light, a lingering dream, or some odd occurrence from the night. But no, The muddy prints were real, and they were undeniable. After some thought, I decided to investigate. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the cool air immediately hitting my skin. The woods seemed even more isolated in the daylight, the trees thick and impenetrable. I walked around the lodge, looking for any signs of disturbance, but the ground around the building was undisturbed, as if no one had been there at all. The footprints, however, led straight from the edge of the woods, stopping just at my bedside. The rest of the property was silent still. I ventured into the woods a little, following the rough path where the footprints might have originated. As I moved deeper, the air grew heavier, the trees crowding around me, blocking out the sunlight. I could hear the occasional snap of a branch underfoot, but other than that, the forest was eerily quiet. There were no animals stirring, no birds calling out. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. Minutes turned into hours as I walked deeper into the woods, but I couldn't find any sign of whoever or whatever had made those prints. The woods seemed endless, stretching in every direction, and though I knew I had to turn back eventually, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease growing in the pit of my stomach. The footprints had led to my room and nowhere else. It was as though someone had been there, watched me sleep, and then disappeared without a trace. By the time I returned to the lodge, I was exhausted. My mind raced, and the uneasy feeling I'd had the night before was now a constant presence, lingering over me like a storm cloud. I needed to leave, to get away from this place, but a strange part of me felt drawn to stay. Something was tethering me to the lodge, and I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, I locked all the windows and doors again, double-checking everything before crawling into bed. But as I lay there, staring into the darkness, I couldn't escape the feeling that I wasn't alone. The footprints, the strange silence in the woods, it all felt like a warning. But a warning of what? And who had been in my room? I eventually drifted off to sleep, but the unease never fully left. In the back of my mind, I wondered if the woods were hiding something, if whatever had left those muddy footprints had never really left at all. And when I woke the next morning, I knew deep down that I would never return to that lodge again. The forest had a secret, and it wasn't ready to let me leave. Story 11. The desert night was quiet, an expanse of nothing but sand, rocks, and the soft, distant hum of the wind. I had been camping out in the vast openness for days, seeking solitude and a bit of peace away from the noise of daily life. There was something calming about the endless horizon and the soundless nights, where the only interruptions were the occasional scurry of a desert creature or the sharp cry of an owl. Tonight, however, the tranquility would be disturbed by something I wasn't prepared for. I had set up my camp near a small cluster of rocks, the flames of my campfire flickering in the cold night air. The heat of the day had faded, and the stars above began to shine brighter than I had ever seen. It felt like I could reach out and touch them if I stretched far enough. The silence was thick, almost palpable, and I settled back against a boulder, savoring the stillness. After a while, I became aware of something unusual in the distance. The faint glow of headlights appeared on the horizon, cutting through the darkness. I thought it was just a passing vehicle, maybe a truck or someone driving through the vast desert at night. But as I watched, the lights didn't seem to be getting any closer. At first, I figured it was an illusion caused by the heat of the desert, but as the minutes passed, the lights stayed exactly where they were, no matter how long I stared at them. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. The headlights had the familiar look of car lights, two bright orbs, one after the other. Yet there was no car to be seen. The lights glowed steadily, hovering above the ground about a mile away. My mind raced to make sense of it. Maybe it was some other kind of vehicle, a Jeep or an ATV, but the way the lights hung in the air, suspended in perfect symmetry, didn't match anything I had seen before. For a brief moment, I convinced myself I was just overtired. After all, I had been hiking and camping for days without much rest. Maybe the heat of the day had gotten to me, and I was seeing things. But as I stared, the lights didn't flicker or fade, they just hovered. They were too steady, too intentional. A chill ran down my spine, and my instincts told me something wasn't right. I had been in the desert for long enough to know that strange things could happen out here, but nothing like this. I stood up, my legs a little wobbly, unsure of what to do. Should I pack up and leave? The lights weren't getting closer, so they didn't seem to be a threat in the traditional sense, but the strangeness of it all was enough to make my heart race. I decided to move toward the lights. It wasn't the smartest decision, but curiosity overpowered caution. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam weak against the vastness of the desert, and started walking toward the source of the glow. The light didn't seem to get any closer as I walked, and with each step, I felt the unease growing. The further I walked, the stranger the lights seemed. They didn't illuminate the landscape like a normal car's headlights would. There was no soft glow spilling across the sand, no shadows from a body or a vehicle, just the lights floating in midair. I felt as though the desert itself had shifted around me, as if the very ground beneath my feet was waiting for something, holding its breath. As I walked, I couldn't help but glance back at the campfire, now a small flicker in the distance. The world around me seemed to quiet even more, if that was possible. My own breathing felt too loud, each footstep too heavy. It was as though I were intruding on something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. The lights finally began to change, moving. Slowly at first, then picking up speed, shifting in a way that felt unnatural, like they were being guided by some unseen force. They zigzagged in the air, moving erratically but with a sense of purpose. My heart raced as I realized they weren't behaving like car lights at all. There was something distinctly otherworldly about their motion, the way they darted and swerved, as if they were alive. I stopped, frozen in place, the beam of my flashlight shaking in my hand. The lights stopped too. For a moment, everything was still. The desert was as silent as it had been when I first arrived. The air felt thick, charged, as if something was about to happen. I didn't know whether to run, scream, or just stand there and wait for whatever was next. Then, without warning, the lights surged forward, but not toward me. They rushed toward the ground, and I could see them moving lower, closer to the sand. I took a step back, my breath caught in my throat, but they continued, drifting across the desert as if they had no need for the constraints of the earth. I couldn't look away. The lights slowly began to dissipate, pulling away from the ground and rising once more, higher and higher into the air. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a sensation I couldn't explain. They rose quickly, until they were nothing more than tiny pinpricks in the vastness of the desert sky. I stood there, staring into the night, the only sounds now the beating of my own heart and the quiet rush of wind across the sand. And then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the lights were gone. The desert returned to its natural silence, as though nothing had happened at all. I stood there for what seemed like an eternity, unsure of what to think. Had I imagined it? Was I simply too tired, too worn down by the desert to trust my own senses? I turned back to my camp, my feet heavy with each step. The desert was empty once more, just the sand and the sky. But the feeling of being watched lingered, a sense of something unexplainable, something that didn't belong. I lay down beside the flickering campfire, my mind still racing. I knew I wouldn't sleep much that night. Whatever I had seen, whatever it was, had left a mark on me that I couldn't shake. Story 12. I had been driving for hours when I finally arrived in the small town, desperate for a place to rest. The roads had gotten progressively more desolate as the night wore on, and I hadn't passed a single car in what felt like miles. The town itself looked like something out of a different era, quiet, old-fashioned, with a few buildings lined up along a single main street. After searching for a while, I found the inn tucked away in a corner, a single light glowing in the lobby. It looked old, but not in a run-down way. There was something comforting about its warm glow amidst the darkness outside. The front desk clerk was an older man, his face weathered but kind. He smiled at me as I approached the counter, the bell above the door jingling behind me. "Welcome," he said in a low, gravelly voice. "Room for one." I nodded, feeling the exhaustion from my long drive settling into my bones. As he checked me in, he handed me the room key, but his expression grew more serious. "If anyone knocks on your door past midnight, don't answer," he said, his voice almost a whisper. I raised an eyebrow, thinking I hadn't heard him right. He met my gaze, his eyes dark and unreadable. "Just don't open the door, no matter what," he added, his tone a little firmer. I tried to brush it off as some odd, quirky local superstition, but I couldn't help feeling uneasy. After all, it was a small-town inn, and the last thing I needed was to get wrapped up in some strange local custom. I took the key, nodded, and thanked him, then made my way to my room. The hallway was dimly lit, the carpets faded but clean, and the air smelled faintly of old wood and dust. My room was at the end of the hall, and when I opened the door, I was greeted by a small, simple space. The bed was comfortable enough, the bathroom spotless, and a small window looked out onto the empty street below. I tried to shake off the weird warning. Who could be knocking on my door in the middle of the night anyway? The place seemed quiet and peaceful, too quiet maybe. The kind of quiet where you could hear every little sound, every creak of the floorboards and rustle of the wind. I made myself comfortable, unpacking a few things, setting up my laptop to catch up on some work. The night dragged on as I typed away, the hours ticking by slower than usual. I noticed that the clock on the nightstand was moving oddly fast, but I chalked it up to my exhaustion. It wasn't long before I glanced up at the clock again, noticing the time had crept past midnight. I was starting to get sleepy, the work growing harder to focus on. That's when I heard it. A soft knock. 3 knocks, spaced out just enough to make me question whether I had imagined it. My heart skipped a beat. I glanced at the door, my stomach tightening. The knock had come from the direction of the hallway, just outside my room. I froze. The warning from the front desk clerk flashed through my mind. "If anyone knocks on your door past midnight, don't answer." I sat there, staring at the door, my hand trembling slightly on the edge of my laptop. The knocking came again. 3 more knocks, this time louder. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I listened intently. Whoever it was, they were persistent. I glanced at the clock again, 12:15 a.m., just past the witching hour. A rush of anxiety swept through me. I knew what I had to do. I had to ignore it. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and lay back against the pillows, staring at the ceiling, trying to steady my breathing. The knocks continued for a few more minutes, growing louder, more insistent, almost as though someone were trying to break down the door. My pulse quickened, and I pressed my hands over my ears, hoping the sound would stop. But it didn't. Instead, I heard something else, footsteps. They crept slowly down the hallway, their rhythm uneven, dragging like someone wasn't quite lifting their feet. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. There was a moment of stillness, and then the handle jiggled. My heart nearly stopped in my chest. Whoever was out there was trying to get in. My mind raced with questions, but I couldn't answer any of them. What if I was just being paranoid? What if it was someone from the staff checking in on me? But the warning had been so specific, so urgent. It couldn't be just some mistake. The seconds felt like hours. I held my breath, my body tense, waiting for something to happen. The footsteps began again, slowly fading away, but they didn't go very far. I could hear them lingering outside the window now, the faint scrape of shoes against the gravel as if someone was pacing. The hairs on my arms stood up. I stayed completely still, too afraid to move, too afraid to do anything that might give away my presence. Eventually, the sound of the footsteps faded into silence. It was then that I realized how much time had passed. I cautiously got up from the bed, my legs shaky beneath me, and walked to the door. There was no knocking now, no sign of anyone outside. I peered through the peephole, but all I saw was darkness. Slowly, I backed away from the door, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. What had I heard? Who had been out there? And why had they left without saying a word? I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind made me jump. But when the sun finally rose, I decided to leave. I packed up my things quickly and made my way down to the front desk, where the same clerk was sitting, reading the newspaper. He looked up as I approached, his eyes studying me for a moment. "Did you hear it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He gave a small nod, as if he already knew the answer. "The knocks?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, my stomach sinking. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "it's better not to know what's out there." I didn't ask him anything more as I left the inn, the warning still echoing in my head. What had happened the night before? And what exactly was the clerk trying to protect me from? As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the inn's door, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just the quiet of the early morning and the long road ahead. Story 13. I had always been intrigued by abandoned places, and an old prison just outside town seemed like the perfect location to explore. It had been shut down for decades, but rumors persisted that the place was haunted, with stories of strange noises and sightings of figures lurking in the shadows. Still, I couldn't resist the temptation. Armed with nothing but a flashlight, a camera, and my own curiosity, I entered the prison grounds late one afternoon. The first thing that hit me was the smell, a mixture of decay, dampness, and something metallic that I couldn't quite place. The air was thick with dust, and the silence was almost suffocating. The prison was a maze of crumbling stone walls and rusted metal bars. I carefully stepped through the halls, my footsteps echoing off the walls, the weight of history pressing down on me. Each cell seemed to have its own story to tell, the graffiti on the walls and broken furniture a testament to the years of abandonment. As I ventured deeper into the prison, I felt an increasing sense of unease. The walls were covered in peeling paint, the floors littered with broken glass and debris. I could almost feel the weight of the place, the ghosts of the past lingering in every corner. I walked through the long corridors, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but the further I went, the more isolated I felt. It was as though the prison had come alive around me, its history reaching out in subtle, unsettling ways. When I turned a corner, I was faced with a row of old cells, their iron doors barely hanging on their hinges. Most of the doors were closed, but one stood slightly ajar. I was drawn to it immediately, the strange motion of the door catching my attention. It was gently swinging back and forth, creaking softly on its rusty hinges, but there was no breeze, no wind. The air was still, and yet the door continued to sway as though it were being pushed by an unseen force. I froze in place, staring at the door, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My breath caught in my throat as I cautiously stepped closer. The sound of the door creaking with each swing was eerie, like a whisper of something long gone. I checked the hallway around me, but it was empty. No one else was there. I was alone, but the door kept moving. My mind raced. Had the door always been like this? Was I imagining it? I moved closer, my footsteps slow and deliberate, careful not to disturb the unsettling rhythm of the door. It swung gently back and forth, but there was no sign of anything that could be causing it. No draft, no movement in the air, nothing. I reached out and hesitated before touching the door. It felt cold to the touch, the metal smooth under my fingers. But as soon as I made contact, the door stopped moving, falling into an unnatural stillness. For a moment I just stood there, my heart pounding, wondering if I had disturbed whatever force was making it swing. I slowly stepped back, keeping my eyes fixed on the door, but it didn't move again. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The silence that followed was almost oppressive. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling of dread creeping over me, and decided to continue exploring. But the door was still on my mind. I couldn't explain what I had seen, and I found myself wanting to know more, to understand what had caused the door to move like that. I stepped away from the cell and walked further into the prison. The deeper I went, the more the feeling of unease grew. I passed by row after row of empty cells, their doors locked tight. There were signs of the prison's violent past, old stains on the floors, broken furniture, and the remnants of past inmates' lives scattered about. I couldn't help but wonder how many people had walked these halls, how many lives had been ruined within these walls. It was almost as if the prison itself carried the weight of its history, a history that I had only begun to scratch the surface of. As I turned another corner, I came upon a small room that looked like it had once been used for solitary confinement. The door to the room was partially open, and I could see a small cot inside. My curiosity piqued, I stepped forward, but as I passed the door, I heard a faint sound behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the room, but there was nothing. The sound had been so quiet, so subtle, that I wasn't sure if I had actually heard it or if my mind had been playing tricks on me. I was about to turn back when I felt it again, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. It was as though the air had thickened, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward me. I quickly turned and hurried out of the room, not wanting to stay any longer. As I passed by the row of cells again, I couldn't help but glance back at the swinging door. It had started moving again, gently creaking with each swing as though calling me back. My heartbeat quickened. I couldn't understand why the door was doing this, or why it seemed to be drawing me in. There was something about it, something about that movement that felt almost alive. I knew it was irrational, but I felt compelled to approach it once more. This time, when I reached out to touch it, I didn't hesitate. I braced myself for whatever might happen, half expecting the door to suddenly swing violently or for something to leap out at me. But nothing happened. The door just kept swaying back and forth, slow and deliberate. As I stood there, my eyes locked on the motion. I heard something else, faint at first, then louder, a sound like breathing, deep and ragged. It came from the darkness beyond the door. My pulse raced as I stepped back, the sound growing louder, more pronounced. I turned and fled down the hall, my feet pounding against the concrete floor. The breathing followed me, echoing through the empty corridors. I didn't stop running until I reached the entrance of the prison, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I burst out into the daylight, the sun harsh against my eyes after the darkness of the building. I never looked back. And to this day, I still wonder what was behind that door, and whether it was something that should have stayed locked away forever. Story 14. I had always been drawn to old, forgotten places, the ones left behind by time. The train yard was no exception. It had once been a bustling hub, filled with the sounds of trains coming and going, but now it was nothing more than a relic, rusting in the open air. The tracks had been torn up years ago, and the few remnants of train cars that were left behind were slowly succumbing to the elements, their metal bodies crumbling away. I wandered through the yard, the sound of my boots crunching over gravel the only noise in the otherwise still environment. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard as I explored the remnants of what had once been a thriving industrial site. The air smelled faintly of oil and decay, and the silence was both peaceful and unsettling at the same time. It felt as though I had stepped into a forgotten world, where the passage of time had left nothing but a few broken pieces of history. The farther I walked, the more I felt the weight of the place pressing down on me. It was a feeling I couldn't explain, like the yard itself was holding onto something, memories of a past long gone, maybe, or secrets it wasn't ready to let go of. As I reached the end of the yard, where the remnants of the tracks had been removed and the ground was now covered in grass and weeds, I paused for a moment, letting the stillness settle around me. That was when I heard it. A distant whistle. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat as I turned toward the sound. It came from the direction where the tracks had once been, the place where nothing but an empty expanse of land remained. I frowned, straining my ears to listen, but the tracks were gone. There was no way a train could be coming through here. And yet the whistle sounded again, long and mournful, like an old train signaling its departure. I took a step forward, my heart racing as I looked around the yard. The sound seemed to be coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once, echoing through the abandoned cars and empty spaces between them. I knew there was no train here, no conductor or passengers. The train yard had been out of use for years, long before I ever set foot in it. So why did it feel as though something was moving just beyond my sight, something that didn't belong in the present? The whistle sounded again, louder this time, followed by the low rumble of what seemed like a train moving down the tracks. But there were no tracks left. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I moved closer to the spot where the sound seemed to originate. I couldn't see anything, not even the faintest outline of a train in the fading light. Yet the sound of wheels on metal was unmistakable, growing closer, as if the train was speeding toward me. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Could it be some kind of illusion? A memory of the past echoing through the ruins of the yard? I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that I wasn't alone in this abandoned place. The air grew colder, and I pulled my jacket tighter around myself, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I stepped forward, my eyes scanning the area for any sign of the train, but there was nothing. No shadow of a passing locomotive, no sign of movement in the wreckage of the train cars. The sound of the whistle faded, replaced by the steady thrum of what could have been a distant engine. It was coming closer, getting louder, but still, I couldn't see anything. The tracks, once so familiar, now seemed like a distant memory, like a dream I couldn't quite recall. Then, as if on cue, the sound stopped. The whistle, the rumbling of the train had all vanished, leaving only the eerie silence once again. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The train yard was empty, silent, just as it had been when I first arrived. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lingering in the air, something that didn't belong in the present. I turned to leave, my mind swirling with questions, but just as I reached the edge of the yard, I heard it once more. The faintest whistle, far off in the distance, as though the train was still out there, waiting for its next departure. My heart skipped a beat, and I hurried out of the yard, eager to leave behind the strange and unsettling atmosphere that had settled over me. As I stepped into the street and looked back at the yard, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of loss. The yard was silent now, the sounds of the train long gone. But in my mind, the whistle still echoed, a haunting reminder of something that had once been. The train, or whatever it was gone, but its presence lingered, like a shadow stretching across the landscape. I never went back to the train yard after that day. Every time I passed by, I couldn't shake the feeling that the whistle would call out again, that the train would return from wherever it had come. And though I tried to convince myself it had all been a trick of the mind, a product of the empty space and my overactive imagination, a small part of me couldn't help but wonder if the train had never truly left. Perhaps it was still out there, moving along tracks that only it could see, waiting for someone to hear its call once more. Story 15. The historic hotel was a place that seemed to breathe with age, its walls heavy with stories and whispers of the past. I had just started working the night shift at the front desk, a quiet job that mostly involved answering a few calls and keeping an eye on the small number of guests staying there. The hotel had a charm to it, with its old wood floors, grand chandeliers, and vintage furniture that felt like it had been untouched for decades. It was the kind of place that made you feel like you were stepping into another time, which was exactly what I liked about it. I had heard the rumors about the hotel before I took the job. Stories of odd occurrences, strange sounds in the hallways, and the occasional guest who's seen something they couldn't explain. But those were just stories, right? I shrugged them off as nothing more than the product of overactive imaginations. That was until the phone call started. It began on my second night. The phone at the front desk rang at precisely 2:47 a.m., cutting through the quiet of the lobby like a sharp knife. It was odd for the phone to ring at all. Most of the guests were long asleep by then, and there wasn't much reason for the phone to be in use. I picked up the receiver, ready to take a call from a late-night guest or perhaps someone calling in for a reservation. But when I spoke into the receiver, there was only silence on the other end. I checked the hotel's guest register to confirm that no one was staying in room 407, the only room that had a direct line to the front desk. Sure enough, it was empty. I hung up, confused but not particularly worried. Maybe it was a mistake or a misdial from a guest. I let it go, thinking it was just one of those odd occurrences that would happen now and then. But then the phone rang again the next night, and the night after that. It became a nightly routine. At exactly 2:47 a.m., the phone would ring, and I would answer, only to be met with silence. The guest register always confirmed that room 407 was empty, and no one had checked in. It started to get under my skin, and I found myself looking over my shoulder every time I walked past the hallway leading to room 407. I could never shake the feeling that someone was there, even when I knew for a fact that the room was unoccupied. I tried everything I could think of to explain it. I checked the wiring for any faults, assuming the phone lines might be malfunctioning. I even called the phone company to check for any issues, but they assured me everything was fine. The strange thing was, the calls never came from a visible number, just a blank line. It wasn't just the ringing that unnerved me, it was the timing. The calls always came at 2:47 a.m., every single night without fail. One evening, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided I was going to confront the source of the calls. When the clock struck 2:47 and the phone rang once more, I answered it as usual, but this time I wasn't going to hang up. I would stay on the line no matter how long it took to figure out who or what was on the other end. I could feel my pulse quicken as I raised the receiver to my ear. The silence was deafening at first, but then slowly I heard it. A faint breathing. Soft, shallow, as though someone was trying to control their breath so they wouldn't be heard. I couldn't make out any words, just the sound of someone inhaling and exhaling. The noise sent a chill down my spine, but I stayed still, unwilling to give in to the fear creeping up my back. "Hello?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. The breathing stopped for a moment, and then I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible voice, like a whisper in the dark. It was so faint that I had to strain to catch the words. "Help me," it said. "I'm still here." My heart skipped a beat, and my grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling now. "What do you need?" There was no reply, only the soft static of the line and that faint, breathy sound. I waited, feeling my nerves tighten, but there was nothing. Just the silence. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the line went dead. I stared at the phone, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next day, I tried to shake off what had occurred. Maybe it had been a prank, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. The long hours in the Eerie hotel getting to me. But when the call came again the next night, exactly at 2:47 a.m., I was ready. I answered it immediately, determined to find out who was on the other end. But this time there was no whisper, no soft breathing. There was only silence, heavy and oppressive. I hung up, feeling a growing unease. Something about it felt wrong. It felt like I was being drawn into something that I wasn't meant to understand. I checked the guest register again, hoping for some sort of explanation. Room 407 was still listed as vacant, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting there. A week passed, and the calls continued. I started avoiding room 407, even though I had no real reason to be scared. It was just a room after all. But the calls kept coming every night at 2:47 a.m. I couldn't ignore them anymore. One night I decided to confront the room itself. I grabbed the master key and headed up to the 4th floor. The door to room 407 creaked as I opened it, the darkness inside swallowing the light from the hallway. The room was exactly as I had imagined it, an old 4-poster bed, a large window that looked out over the city, and a thick layer of dust covering every surface. But something was different. There was a palpable stillness, a heavy weight that pressed down on me as I stepped inside. I took a deep breath, my hand trembling as I reached for the phone by the bedside. I lifted it slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and as I did, I heard it again, the soft, breathy whisper, barely audible over the phone line. "I'm still here. Please help me." I froze. The room seemed to close in on me, the air growing colder with every passing second. The voice, so faint and distant, now sounded desperate. I glanced around, but there was nothing, just the empty room, the faint ringing in my ears. And then, the line went silent, the phone going dead in my hands. I left the room, my heart racing, and I never returned to room 407 again. The phone calls stopped after that night, but the memory of them lingered, haunting my thoughts. Every time I passed by that room, I couldn't help but feel the presence of something trapped there, something that hadn't been able to leave. And every night after, I would hear the faintest ringing, distant and faint, like a reminder of the voice that once whispered through the hotel's walls. Story 16. It was well past midnight when I started my drive home. The only sound in the car, the hum of the engine, and the occasional rustle of the wind outside. The road stretched out before me, empty and dark, with nothing but the occasional flicker of my headlights to break up the monotony of the night. The usual route was quiet, almost eerily so, with no cars or signs of life for miles around. As I drove along, my mind began to wander, tired from a long day, and I found myself thinking about everything and nothing all at once. The headlights illuminated the winding road ahead, casting long shadows across the fields and trees on either side. I had driven this stretch countless times, and I knew it like the back of my hand. There was nothing unusual about the night, just the usual stillness and silence that came with being out in the country. But then, out of nowhere, something caught my eye. A figure appeared in the middle of the road, standing completely still. It was tall and thin, a dark silhouette against the pale light of my headlights. I slammed my foot down on the brakes, my heart leaping into my throat as I swerved to the right, narrowly missing the figure. The tires screeched on the asphalt as the car skidded, the steering wheel jerking in my hands. For a split second, everything seemed to happen in slow motion, my mind racing, my breath catching in my chest. But when I finally regained control and came to a stop on the shoulder of the road, I looked back in the rear-view mirror to see nothing. No figure, no sign of anyone at all. The road was empty. I sat frozen in the driver's seat for a moment, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My breath came in short bursts as I tried to process what had just happened. Had I imagined it? I couldn't have, not with how real it had felt. The figure had been right there, directly in my path, standing motionless. It didn't make sense, but I knew what I had seen. My mind raced with possibilities. Had it been an illusion? Maybe I was too tired, my mind playing tricks on me in the dead of night. But no, it had been too vivid, too clear. I could still picture the figure in my mind the way it had been standing there, unnervingly still, like it wasn't even aware of the danger. I told myself to calm down, that it was just my mind getting the better of me. But my heart still pounded in my chest, refusing to let go of the fear. After a few deep breaths, I decided to keep going. The road was quiet again, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I wasn't far from home now, just a few more miles, and I could shake off the unsettling feeling once I got there. But as I drove on, my eyes kept darting to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone following me. The thought of it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I gripped the wheel tighter. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever. The occasional flicker of my headlights was the only indication that I was still moving forward. Every bump in the road, every curve made me tense up, anticipating something out of the ordinary. I couldn't shake the image of the figure standing there in the road. What had it wanted? Why had it been there? The thought gnawed at me, but I couldn't afford to get distracted. I had to focus on the road. And yet the fear wouldn't let go. It clung to me, creeping into my thoughts with every mile. What if it wasn't an accident? What if the figure had been trying to warn me of something? The thought made me shudder, and I pressed the gas pedal a little harder, desperate to put more distance between me and the incident. As I rounded a sharp bend, my headlights illuminated something on the side of the road. I wasn't sure if I was seeing things or if it was another trick of my mind, but something about the shape seemed too familiar. My heart skipped a beat. There, standing just off the edge of the road, was the figure again. I could see it more clearly now, tall, thin, and still. It was like it had materialized out of the darkness itself, a shadow that had no right to be there. I slammed on the brakes again, my hands shaking as I fought to keep the car under control. My mind screamed for me to turn around, to leave, to get away from whatever this was. But I couldn't. I was frozen, staring at the figure in the dark. The headlights cut through the night, illuminating it briefly, but when I looked up again, it was gone. Just like before, there was nothing there, no trace of anyone at all. The silence in the car was deafening, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. My mind spun in circles, unable to grasp what was happening. I glanced around the road once more, my eyes scanning the shadows, expecting to see the figure again. But the road was empty, silent, and still. It was as if the entire world had frozen, waiting for me to make the next move. I didn't wait any longer. I hit the gas and drove faster, my foot pressing down harder than before. I needed to get out of there. The unease that had settled in my chest seemed to tighten with each passing second, as though the air around me was thickening, suffocating me. The road seemed endless, and my mind raced with confusion. What had I seen? What was happening? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I pulled into my driveway, the headlights casting long shadows across the front yard. I threw the car into park and sat there for a moment, my hands still trembling on the wheel. My house was dark, the windows reflecting the glow of the headlights, but there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. The figure hadn't followed me. It hadn't appeared again. I sat in the car for several minutes, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. My mind still couldn't settle, my body still tense from the adrenaline of the drive. Had it been a trick of the mind? Or had something been trying to tell me something? I didn't know. All I knew was that I was home, and the night was still far from over. As I stepped out of the car and walked toward the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was still watching me. Story 17. The bed and breakfast was tucked away on a quiet street at the edge of a sleepy town, a place that seemed stuck in time. It was a charming, old house with creaky floors and faded wallpaper that looked like something out of a storybook. The owner, Mrs. Morrow, was a woman in her 60s with a warm smile and a tendency to speak in soft, measured tones. She greeted me at the door with a gentle handshake, welcoming me to her home as if it were her lifelong duty. As I settled into my room, I noticed the house's peculiarities: the antique furniture, the dim lighting, and the smell of old wood and lavender that seemed to linger in every corner. The bed was comfortable, the quilt a soft patchwork of faded colors, but it was the attic door that caught my attention. It was a small door at the end of the hallway, right above the stairs. What made it stand out was that it was nailed shut, a thick, uneven line of nails securing it in place. When I asked Mrs. Morrow about it over breakfast the next morning, she hesitated for just a moment before offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, the attic," she said, her voice tight with discomfort. "It's just storage up there. Nothing for you to worry about. I had to seal it up years ago for safety reasons." She gave a quick, dismissive wave of her hand as though to put the subject to rest. But something about her reaction didn't sit right with me. There was an odd tension in the air that lingered long after she had moved on to a different topic. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the attic than she was letting on. The thought gnawed at me throughout the day, and I found myself glancing at the door whenever I passed by it. It was like a silent invitation to uncover a hidden truth, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to face whatever was behind it. That evening, I returned to the bed and breakfast after a long walk around the town. The sun had already set, and the house was draped in a heavy quietness, as if it had settled into its own secrets. The hallway was dimly lit by an old lamp at the far end, casting long shadows along the floor. I noticed the attic door again, its nails gleaming faintly in the soft light. My curiosity was bubbling up now, almost uncontrollably, and I couldn't stop myself from walking toward it. I gently tested the door handle, expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, it turned with ease. The door didn't open, though the nails held it firmly shut. I leaned in closer, my breath catching in my throat, and I could feel the faintest draft coming from the crack between the door and the frame. There was a chill in the air, as though something up there was still alive, waiting. A strange sense of unease washed over me, but I couldn't help myself. I knocked on the door lightly, my knuckles tapping softly against the wood. There was no response, no sound from behind the door, no creak or groan of movement. I stood there for a long moment, my mind racing. What could be up there that Mrs. Morrow didn't want me to see? The thought of her being evasive about the attic made my heart race a little faster. The next morning, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Mrs. Morrow was busy in the kitchen preparing breakfast when I slipped out of the house, my shoes making only the faintest squeak against the old wooden floors. I walked around the back of the house to where a small garden lay in the overgrown yard. I had noticed a ladder tucked behind the shed earlier, and without thinking too much about it, I grabbed it and carried it to the side of the house. The ladder was sturdy, but it creaked under my weight as I climbed up toward the roof. I knew I was being reckless, but my curiosity had overtaken all reason. When I reached the top of the house, I paused for a moment, listening for any sounds from inside. There was only silence, the wind rustling the trees nearby, and the faint chirp of crickets in the distance. I made my way to the small window next to the attic door, peering inside. It was dark in there, the room filled with shadows and dust, but I could make out some old furniture, wooden crates, and boxes stacked haphazardly. For a moment I thought I saw a figure moving in the corner of the room, but when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly stepped back from the window. A sudden noise below made me freeze. Mrs. Morrow was standing at the back door, watching me with an unreadable expression. I froze, unsure of how to explain myself. She didn't say anything at first, her gaze sharp and calculating, before she simply nodded toward the ladder. "I see you found your way up," she said quietly. "I wouldn't go poking around in there if I were you." Her words felt like a warning, but also an invitation to press further. I slowly descended the ladder, trying to steady my nerves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line. When I reached the bottom, Mrs. Morrow stood there, blocking the door with her presence. "There are things in this house," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Things that should stay hidden. People who shouldn't be remembered. I'm trying to protect you." I nodded, though I didn't fully understand what she meant. But her eyes were heavy with something unspoken, a weight that seemed to press down on her with every passing second. She stepped aside, allowing me back into the house, but the silence between us was suffocating. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the attic, about the things Miss Morrow had said. Her cryptic warning lingered in my mind like a cold wind. I had come to the bed and breakfast for a peaceful getaway, but now I wasn't sure what I had walked into. The house felt different somehow, as though it was watching me, waiting for something. I knew I wouldn't be able to leave until I understood the mystery of the attic, what it hid, and why it was sealed off so tightly. But I also knew that opening that door could lead me into something far darker than I was prepared to face. The choice, however, had already been made. Story 18. I had heard rumors about the old house on the edge of town for years. It had been abandoned for as long as I could remember, the once grand structure now worn and weathered. Local kids dared each other to explore it, but no one ever stayed long enough to tell their stories. When I decided to venture inside one chilly afternoon, I had no particular expectations, just curiosity about what lay hidden within its walls. The house greeted me with an unsettling quiet, the kind that hangs thick in the air. Dust coated the furniture, and cobwebs clung to the corners, but it was the smell that struck me first. A musty, stagnant odor that spoke of years of neglect. The front door creaked on its hinges as I pushed it open, stepping cautiously over the threshold. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I paused, listening for any signs that I wasn't alone. I took a few steps inside, my flashlight cutting through the dim light. The walls, once painted in a vibrant shade of blue, had faded to a dull gray. The wallpaper was peeling in places. An old, rotting furniture sat in disarray, an overturned chair here, a dusty mirror there. It was as though time had frozen in place the moment the house was abandoned. I made my way to the kitchen, where I had heard some of the more eerie stories came from. As I walked through the narrow hallway, I noticed strange markings on the wall, scratches, faint but deliberate. They looked like they had been made by something long ago, though I couldn't tell what. The kitchen door was ajar, and as I pushed it open, I was met with an unexpected sight. There, in the middle of the room, was a single candle burning on the old wooden table. The flame flickered in the still air, casting long shadows on the cracked tiles beneath. For a moment I stood frozen in the doorway. The candle seemed out of place, almost as though someone had just left. There was no dust around it, no sign that it had been sitting there for long. The wax dripped slowly down the sides of the candle, pooling on the table in a small puddle. I stepped closer, feeling the strange chill of the room seep into my bones. The kitchen was cluttered with remnants of the past: an old sink, a cracked stove, cabinets filled with broken dishes and rusty utensils. The atmosphere felt thick, oppressive, even like the house itself was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened here, that someone had once lived here and maybe still lingered in the shadows. I turned my attention back to the candle, my curiosity getting the better of me. Who had lit it? Why had they left so abruptly? I leaned in, examining the candle more closely. The wick burned steadily, undisturbed by the drafts that swirled through the cracked windows. There was no sign of recent activity, no footprints in the dust, no leftover food, no indication that anyone had been in the house for days. Yet here the candle was, burning in the stillness of the abandoned kitchen. I glanced around, my senses heightened. The silence felt almost suffocating now, the weight of the house pressing in on me. I could almost hear faint whispers carried on the wind, but when I turned, there was nothing. My breath caught in my throat, and I took a step back, considering leaving. But something, some nagging pull, urged me to stay, to look deeper. I couldn't quite explain why, but I needed to understand. I reached out to extinguish the candle, but my fingers hovered just above the flame, as if something was holding me back. The warmth from the flame reached my skin, and I felt an inexplicable sense of dread wash over me. It was as though the candle was a beacon, a reminder of something I wasn't meant to uncover. The air felt heavier with each passing second, as if the house itself was trying to warn me. Suddenly, a soft sound echoed through the house. It creaked from upstairs. I froze, my heart racing. I strained my ears, but the house remained still, save for the occasional groan of the old timber settling. The candle flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls, and I found myself unable to tear my eyes away. The warmth from the flame seemed to pull me closer, drawing me into its light. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the feeling passed. The room returned to its eerie quiet. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I had to leave. This place was starting to get to me, messing with my mind in ways I didn't like. I turned to go, but before I could move, I heard its soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, from above. I spun around, but the kitchen remained empty, the candle still burning. The sound came again, closer now, as though someone was walking down the stairs, approaching me. I felt a cold rush of fear grip my chest. My hand shot out, knocking over the candle. The flame sputtered and died in the puddle of wax, but the smell lingered, something faint, like burning paper, mixed with the scent of dust and age. The house seemed to exhale a long, drawn-out sigh that rattled the windows. I turned to leave, but before I could reach the door, I noticed something strange on the table. A small, crumpled piece of paper. I hadn't seen it there before. I picked it up, unfolding it carefully. The writing on the paper was uneven, as though it had been hastily scrawled. It read, in shaky handwriting, "Don't leave the candle burning." My blood ran cold as the words sunk in. The candle, the footsteps, the oppressive air, it all suddenly made sense. I wasn't alone in this house, and whatever had left the candle burning was still here, waiting. I bolted for the door, not daring to look back, the paper clenched tightly in my hand. As I stepped outside, the weight on my chest lifted. The door slammed behind me, and I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of my car. Even then, as I sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me. The last flicker of that candle burning in my mind. Story 19. The forgotten mining town lay in the valley, nearly swallowed by the relentless march of time. A few crumbling wooden structures stood like skeletal remains of a past long gone. The air was thick with dust, and the faint scent of rust and earth lingered in the wind. I had read about the town in an old history book, a place once alive with industry, now abandoned after a mysterious incident that left everyone fleeing in terror. I was drawn to it, the promise of discovery whispering to me from the pages of the book, urging me to explore its secrets. As I wandered through the dusty streets, the silence felt oppressive, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Most of the buildings had collapsed, their roofs caving in from years of neglect, but some still stood half intact. I ventured into one of the remaining buildings, an old supply store, and carefully pushed open the door. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing into the empty streets. Inside, the air was stale, the shelves bare, except for a few rusted cans and broken tools. It felt as though nothing had been touched in decades. I continued my exploration, moving deeper into the town. The deeper I went, the more I felt an uneasy weight pressing down on me, as if the town had been abandoned for a reason I was too close to uncover. The temperature dropped slightly as I approached the mine's entrance. It was a large, gaping hole in the earth, surrounded by rusted metal and broken wooden supports. The shadows seemed to stretch endlessly inside, and I hesitated for a moment before stepping toward it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I peered into the darkness. A small wooden building stood near the mine's entrance, its door slightly ajar. It looked as if it had been a bunkhouse for the miners or perhaps a storage shed. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pushed the door open, stepping into the dim interior. It smelled of stale wood and mildew. My eyes adjusted to the low light, and I noticed a small desk in the corner. On it, partially hidden under a pile of old papers, was a leather-bound diary. I felt an odd pull toward it, as if it were waiting for me to find it. I picked up the diary carefully, brushing off the dust that had accumulated over the years. The leather was cracked, the edges worn, but it was still intact. I opened it slowly, almost reverently, as though I were about to discover something that had been waiting for decades to be uncovered. The pages were yellowed with age, the ink faded but still legible. The first few entries were mundane, detailing the daily lives of the miners, what they ate, the conditions of the mine, the occasional gossip. But then, as I flipped further into the pages, I began to notice something darker. The entries started to shift. The mood changed, becoming more frantic, the handwriting more erratic. The miners had discovered something deep in the earth, something that had disturbed them. I could feel the tension building as I read, the words growing more desperate with each new entry. They spoke of strange sounds in the mine, whispers in the dark, echoing voices that didn't belong to anyone they knew. At first, they chalked it up to fatigue or the stress of working in such a dangerous environment. But then, the entries began to mention sightings, figures moving in the shadows of the mine, shapes that couldn't be explained. One entry stood out, written in large, hurried letters. "We dug too deep," it said. The rest of the page was a scrawl of frantic sentences, barely legible. It was as though the writer had been rushing to get something down before time ran out. I felt a chill sweep through me as I stared at the words. What had they uncovered? And what had happened to them? I flipped to the next page, my heart pounding. The final entry was dated the day before the town had been abandoned. It was short, but it sent a wave of unease through me. "They're here. We've made a terrible mistake. Oh, don't go into the mine. We dug too deep." The handwriting trailed off, the last few words nearly illegible, as though the writer had been interrupted. There was no mention of what exactly they had found, but the fear in those words was palpable. I closed the diary slowly, my mind racing. The weight of the discovery settled heavily on my shoulders. The town had been abandoned suddenly, with no explanation, and the miners had left everything behind: tools, equipment, even food. The sense of dread that had hung over the town began to make sense now. Something had happened here, something the miners hadn't been able to explain, and whatever it was, it had driven them away. But what had they unearthed? What had they awakened? A loud creak echoed from the direction of the mine, breaking my train of thought. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. It was as if the mine itself was alive, shifting and groaning under its own weight. My eyes darted toward the dark entrance, and for a moment I felt as though something was watching me from within. The mine seemed to call out, pulling me toward it. I took a hesitant step forward, then another, before realizing how foolish I was being. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get out before it was too late. But curiosity gnawed at me, urging me onward. I couldn't resist. I had to know what had been buried here, what the miners had discovered. I turned back toward the mine, the sound of the creaking wood now almost deafening. As I stepped closer to the entrance, I noticed something that hadn't been there before: footprints in the dust, leading down into the depths of the mine. My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone. I took a step back, the diary still clutched tightly in my hand. The air around me felt charged, as though the town itself was alive, and I was its next victim. The ground beneath my feet shifted, and I knew then that whatever had been unearthed in that mine had not been meant for human eyes. The miners had dug too deep, and now it was my turn to face the consequences. Story 20. I had been cleaning out my apartment for weeks, trying to get rid of unnecessary clutter before moving into a smaller place. When the storage unit rental offer came up, it seemed like the perfect solution to get rid of things I couldn't throw away but didn't want to keep around. The unit was located in a nondescript warehouse building on the outskirts of town, tucked between a mechanic's shop and an abandoned bakery. It felt like the kind of place you'd never remember driving past, and I liked the anonymity of it. The storage facility had a cold, metallic smell that clung to the walls, and the lights flickered intermittently overhead. I grabbed the key from the front desk and headed down the narrow corridor, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The unit I had been assigned was at the far end of the building, tucked away behind rows of other nondescript doors. I unlocked it with a bit of effort, the rusted key barely turning, and pushed open the heavy metal door, expecting to find boxes and bags stacked haphazardly like in any other storage unit. But what I saw instead was enough to stop me in my tracks. The unit was dark, save for the dim overhead light that barely illuminated the far corners. In the center of the room sat an old wooden rocking chair, rocking back and forth slowly, as if it had been gently nudged by someone unseen. The sound of the wood creaking against the concrete floor was soft but unmistakable, a slow, rhythmic movement that sent a chill crawling up my spine. I stood there, frozen for a moment, watching the chair sway back and forth with no visible cause. It wasn't windy, and there was no draft in the air to explain its movement. My first thought was that it was some kind of weird prank. Maybe someone had placed the chair there just to mess with me, or it was a forgotten relic of a previous tenant. But the longer I watched, the more I realized how unnatural the movement felt. I stepped forward cautiously, my feet making soft thudding noises on the concrete. As I approached the chair, the air around it felt colder, like stepping into a shadow. I was close enough now to see that the chair wasn't just moving on its own, it was moving too smoothly, too fluidly, like it had been in motion for hours. The legs barely scraped the floor, the creaking sound oddly soothing, though it did nothing to calm the growing knot in my stomach. I reached out, hand trembling, and hovered near the back of the chair, but I didn't dare touch it. Something inside me told me not to disturb it, to turn around and leave. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. My heart hammered in my chest, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it all, if the chair had somehow been knocked over and was now caught in some weird rhythm. But when I stepped back, the rocking didn't stop. The more I looked at it, the more my unease grew. There was something off about the chair itself. Its wood was too dark, too polished for the rest of the room, like it didn't belong there at all. And the movement, that slow, steady back and forth, felt deliberate. It wasn't just a random rocking, it was an invitation. I had to force myself to look away, but the thought of leaving without knowing who had placed it there, or why it was moving on its own, gnawed at my curiosity. I walked around the unit, looking for anything that might explain the rocking chair. There were boxes piled in corners, some old furniture draped in dusty sheets, but nothing that stood out. The more I searched, the more unsettling the room became. The chair continued to rock, its creaking sound growing louder with each passing second, until it was all I could hear. It was as if the rest of the world had faded away, leaving me alone in this strange, forgotten space. In the back corner, half hidden under a stack of cardboard boxes, I spotted something, a small, weathered journal. It had clearly been there for years, the leather cover cracked and stained with age. The handwriting inside was faint, but I could make out enough to know it had been written by someone who had spent a lot of time here, perhaps long before I had rented the unit. As I flipped through the pages, I realized that the entry spoke of loneliness, isolation, and strange occurrences. One entry stood out, written in hurried, almost frantic script. I don't know why it's here, but I know it's watching me. I've tried to leave, but the door won't open. The chair rocks even when there's no one here. It's waiting for me. My heart dropped into my stomach. I had to get out of there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. I stood up quickly, the journal slipping from my hand and falling to the floor with a soft thud. But as I turned to leave, the rocking chair stopped moving. The silence in the unit was suddenly deafening, and I felt the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. I looked over my shoulder just once before I bolted out of the unit and slammed the door behind me, the sound echoing through the long hallway. I didn't stop running until I was out of the building, breathing hard and feeling like I had just narrowly escaped something. The next day I returned to the storage facility, my hands shaking as I approached the counter. I had to see if the chair was still there, to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining it. But when the attendant led me to my unit, it was completely empty. The rocking chair was gone. The room was just as I had left it, save for the boxes and forgotten odds and ends. No trace of the journal, no sign of anything that had been there before. I asked the attendant if anyone had been in the unit recently, if it had been rented before, but he just shook his head. No, that unit's been empty for a while, he said, his expression unreadable. I left shortly after, my mind still racing. There was no explanation for what had happened, no reason why the chair had been there, or who had left the journal behind. But as I drove away from the storage facility, I couldn't shake the feeling that the chair wasn't gone, it was waiting for someone else. Story 21. I had been hiking in the mountains for hours, the crisp air filling my lungs as I pushed through the dense woods. The trail was narrow, overgrown with brambles and thick underbrush, but I loved the isolation. There was something calming about being surrounded by towering trees and the sound of birds calling above. As the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain, I decided to push on, determined to reach the summit before nightfall. The path began to narrow even more, and the forest gave way to rocky cliffs that rose steeply on both sides. I was getting closer to the ridge where I'd hoped to find a panoramic view of the valley below. But instead of a grand vista, I stumbled upon something unexpected: an old radio tower, its skeletal frame rising out of the undergrowth like a forgotten relic. The tower was weathered, covered in rust, and seemed to have been abandoned for years. There were no signs of life, no sounds, nothing to suggest that anyone had been up here in decades. I approached cautiously, my curiosity piqued by the strange sight. The tower was perched on a small plateau, isolated from the rest of the mountain. It stood tall and imposing, its metal legs creaking softly in the wind. As I got closer, I noticed a small shack at the base of the tower, the door slightly ajar. The windows were dirty, and the wood had warped, giving the place an eerie, decaying feel. It looked like something straight out of an old horror movie, abandoned and forgotten. Still, there was a part of me that felt drawn to it, a sense of unfinished business that I couldn't explain. I cautiously stepped closer to the shack, my boots crunching on the gravel beneath my feet. The air around the tower was heavy, almost oppressive, and I felt an odd chill despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. I reached out and pushed open the door to the shack. It groaned on its hinges, revealing a dusty, dimly lit interior. There were shelves lining the walls, cluttered with old equipment, wires, and scattered papers. On one of the tables, an old radio transmitter sat, its dials worn from years of use. As I took a few steps inside, something strange happened. The low hum of static filled the room. At first, I thought it was just the noise of the radio equipment, a result of the abandoned electronics. But then, I realized that the static was punctuated by a faint sound, something that resembled a voice. It was barely audible, crackling through the radio like a distant whisper. My heart skipped a beat. I leaned closer, straining to make out the words, but it was impossible to decipher. The voice was repeating the same phrase over and over, a message caught in time. The words were garbled at first, but as I fiddled with the dials on the old radio, I could make out the word distress. The voice sounded frantic, desperate, as if whoever was speaking had been trying to reach someone for a long time. The message was broken, fragmented, as though the signal had been transmitted through years of decay. I felt an uneasy knot in my stomach. Who could have left this message here? And why was it still broadcasting after all this time? I took a step back from the radio, my mind racing. The station appeared to be abandoned, the tower long since forgotten. But the distress signal was still alive, still calling out, as if it had been waiting for someone to find it. I looked around the shack for any clues as to who might have left the message behind, but there was nothing. No documents, no signs of life, just dust and disarray. I felt an overwhelming sense of isolation, as though I had stumbled upon something that was never meant to be uncovered. The radio continued to hum, the voice growing more frantic as I adjusted the frequency. The static became louder, the voice clearer, though the words still eluded me. I reached for my backpack, pulling out my phone in the hope of capturing the sound or maybe calling for help. But the signal was non-existent out here. I was truly alone, miles from civilization. It felt like I had stepped into another world, one where time had stopped and the past was reaching out for help. I stood there for a long moment, my fingers hovering over the dials of the radio. I had an overwhelming urge to shut it off, to silence the voice that had been calling out for so long. But something stopped me. It was as if the voice, the distress signal, needed to be heard, needed to be acknowledged. I couldn't just walk away, not without knowing more. After a few minutes of adjusting the radio, the voice became clearer. It was no longer just a garbled whisper. Now it was distinct, though still filled with static. The words were finally legible. "We're still out here, we're waiting. Please find us." The message repeated over and over, each time growing weaker, more desperate. My breath caught in my throat. Who was this? Who had left this message, and why was it still broadcasting after all these years? I felt a wave of unease wash over me, and my instincts told me it was time to leave. I backed away from the radio, my mind whirling with questions. What was this place? What happened here? I turned and made my way outside, my eyes scanning the mountainside for any sign of life. But there was nothing, just the towering trees and the looming presence of the radio tower, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the sky. As I made my way back down the mountain, the image of the tower remained in my mind. The voice on the radio, the sense of urgency in the message, gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had been left behind, something I had barely scratched the surface of. I had no answers, only questions, and a deep, unsettling feeling that the past wasn't as distant as it seemed. Story 22. The mansion stood at the edge of town, perched on a hill like something from another century. It was imposing, with its ivy-covered walls and towering spires, the kind of place you'd only see in old movies. I had arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the overgrown garden. The innkeeper, an elderly woman with sharp eyes and an air of mystery, had greeted me warmly but said little else, leaving me to my own devices. The mansion was magnificent, filled with antique furniture, dark wood paneling, and the smell of old books and dust. I wandered the halls, my footsteps echoing against the polished floors, exploring the rooms as the evening sun grew fainter. Eventually I came upon the library, a vast room that felt both inviting and imposing. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, their shelves crammed with leather-bound volumes, many of which looked ancient. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, and large windows let in the last of the day's light, casting a warm glow over the room. I walked deeper into the library, running my fingers along the spines of the books as I passed. The air felt cooler in here, the silence almost absolute except for the faint rustling of pages from the occasional breeze. I loved the feeling of libraries, how they seem to contain not just stories but a certain kind of magic. The power to transport you to places both real and imagined. I pulled out a few books at random, glancing through their pages, but nothing really caught my attention until I spotted something odd. On a shelf near the back of the room, almost hidden behind a row of dusty volumes, was a book that stood out. Its cover was a deep, rich crimson, and it was slightly larger than the others. Curious, I reached for it, surprised by the weight of the book. The moment my fingers brushed against the cover, a strange chill ran through me. I opened the book, expecting to find something old and faded, but instead I was greeted by my own name. Not just any name, my full name, written clearly across the cover in gold letters. My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the title, which read, "The Life and Times of My Full Name." The book was clearly old, the edges of the pages worn, but it looked freshly bound. My hands trembled as I opened the first page. The text inside was in a cursive script, the ink dark and precise, as if written by hand. The first sentence on the page struck me like a blow. "You may be wondering how your life became a story." I froze, the words sinking in like a heavy weight. I flipped through the pages, my breath shallow as I scanned the text. There were details in the book that only I knew, places I'd visited, memories I'd made, thoughts I'd had. It described moments from my childhood, my travels, even some of the more obscure dreams I had written down in journals. Each page was a story, but one that I had never written, never shared with anyone. I felt an uncomfortable sense of déjà vu, as if I had stumbled upon something I wasn't meant to find. The further I flipped, the more details appeared, some of them so specific they seemed impossible. The time I spent in a small town during a road trip, the old oak tree I had sat under for hours just thinking, my thoughts about moving to a new city. It was all there, written out in elegant prose. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I turned the pages faster, desperate to see where this book would take me. But the further I went, the more I realized something unsettling. The book was not just describing my past, it was predicting my future. The last few pages of the book had not yet been filled with text. The pages were blank, save for one last sentence scrawled at the bottom of the final page. "The next chapter begins soon." I closed the book with a snap, my breath ragged in my chest. I couldn't explain it. How could this book exist? How could it contain everything about my life, both lived and yet to come? I felt a sudden surge of panic and shoved the book back onto the shelf, as if putting it away could erase its existence. But even as I did so, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The room felt different now, as though the air had thickened, the walls pressing in around me. I left the library quickly, my mind racing with questions. How had this book appeared here? How did it know everything about me? I couldn't get the image of my name on the cover out of my head, and the words "the next chapter begins soon" echoed in my mind like a warning. I returned to my room, but I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were a whirlwind spinning around the book, the strange sensation that something was watching me, waiting for me to do something. The mansion seemed quieter now, as if it too were holding its breath. I tried to distract myself with television, but every flicker of the screen, every shadow in the corner of the room, sent my thoughts spiraling back to the library. I knew I had to go back. When the clock struck midnight, I found myself standing in front of the library door again. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, half expecting it to resist, as if the mansion itself was trying to keep me away. But the door swung open easily, and I stepped inside. The library was darker now, the only light coming from the pale glow of the moon through the windows. The shelves loomed around me, silent and imposing. I walked back to the shelf where I had found the book earlier. But when I reached for the spot, the book was gone. The space where it had once been was empty, the shelf now just a row of dusty volumes. I felt my pulse quicken as I looked around the room. There was no sign of it anywhere, no trace of the crimson-covered book that had contained so much of my life. I searched the entire room, my mind racing. What was going on? Had I imagined it? Had the book somehow disappeared, or had it never been there at all? As I turned to leave, I noticed something different. On the far wall, in the corner, there was a single new book on the shelf. It was familiar and identical crimson cover, the gold letters spelling out my name again. My stomach dropped as I realized what it meant. The next chapter had already begun. Story 23. I had been driving for hours, the endless expanse of the desert stretching out in all directions. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting an eerie orange glow over the cracked asphalt. I'd seen a few small towns off in the distance, but they all seemed abandoned, with faded signs and dusty streets. As the last of the light bled away, I began to wonder if I was even heading in the right direction. It wasn't until I rounded a bend in the road that I spotted it, a small gas station, perched like a forgotten relic in the middle of nowhere. The sign that hung above the pumps was so weathered, it was nearly impossible to read. But the station itself seemed intact, as if it had been preserved by time. I wasn't sure if it was still operational, but my fuel gauge was dangerously close to empty, and I had no other options. I decided to pull in, hoping I wasn't about to stumble into some abandoned ruin. I eased the car to a stop in front of the pumps, which looked surprisingly well maintained. There was no sign of life, no attendant, no customers, but the old-fashioned pump stood ready, as if waiting to serve someone. The windows of the small station were dark, and the building itself seemed empty. Still, I had no choice. I stepped out of the car and walked up to the pump, half expecting it to be out of order or completely dried up. But when I tried the nozzle, to my surprise, it clicked to life with a satisfying hiss, and the gas began to flow. I stood there for a moment, the sound of the fuel filling my tank strangely loud in the silence of the desert night. There was something unsettling about the whole situation, the way the pumps seemed to work perfectly even though the station had clearly been abandoned for years. The thought crossed my mind that this place might have been some kind of mirage, a figment of my tired mind. But the gas was real, and the tank was filling up. I glanced around again, hoping to catch sight of anyone, but the place was still as empty as it had been when I arrived. I finished fueling, but before I could even think about leaving, I noticed something odd. A shadow seemed to move behind the windows of the station, just at the edge of my vision. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The desert wind rustled the dry plants around the station, but that shadow, it had moved on its own, and it had been far too deliberate. I tried to dismiss it, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I was alone out here, so I thought. The night had grown colder, and the chills seeped into my bones as I walked back to my car. The tires crunched on the gravel as I started the engine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the place. I glanced back at the station through the rearview mirror. The pump still stood, silent and waiting, and in the dimming light, the station seemed almost alive, as if it were a thing that had been waiting for me. I drove on for another hour, the desert stretching out endlessly before me. The road was long, and the darkness grew deeper with every passing minute. I kept thinking about the gas station, how it shouldn't have worked, how everything about it seemed out of place. But I couldn't shake the memory of the shadow behind the windows. I tried to put it out of my mind, telling myself it was just a trick of the light, but the uneasy feeling lingered. As I crept down the road, I saw something flicker in the distance, another light, small and faint, like the glow of a lantern. My mind raced. Was it another station? Another mirage? It seemed impossible, but the thought of a place so far out in the desert with no one around to maintain it struck me as strange. I decided to take a detour and check it out, my curiosity now fully piqued. When I arrived at the second light, I was stunned to find another gas station, this one even older than the first. It was much smaller, with a single pump that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. But the thing that caught my eye was the faint glow emanating from the windows. The station itself was clearly abandoned, its paint chipped and faded, and yet there was something about it that felt wrong. The glow from the windows seemed to pulse, like it was beckoning me closer. I approached the building slowly, hesitant but drawn in by some unseen force. The doors were locked, but there was no sign of life anywhere. I knocked on the window, half expecting someone to appear out of nowhere, but no one did. The glow from inside flickered again, and that's when I realized there was something moving behind the glass. At first I thought it was just the shadows shifting, but then I saw it more clearly, a figure, standing motionless by the light. It wasn't human. It was tall, almost skeletal, with a form that seemed to blur at the edges. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away from the window. I turned quickly and ran back to my car, but as I glanced over my shoulder, I swore I saw the figure standing at the door, watching me leave. I slammed the door shut and sped away, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop driving until I was well past the station and far out into the desert. Even now, as I look back on it, I can't explain what I saw or why it happened. I never found out what that place was, or why it seemed to be waiting for me. All I know is that I never returned to that stretch of highway, and I never stopped wondering if the gas stations I had found were real, or if they had been a ghostly apparition, drawing in travelers like me with promises of something familiar but ultimately something far darker. Story 24. The cemetery was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy on the soul, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. I had come here to clear my mind, to walk among the old stones and tombs, reflecting on the past. The setting sun cast long shadows across the rows of gravestones, and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind was the only sound that broke the stillness. It was peaceful in a way, but there was an underlying sense of unease, as if the cemetery was a place where time had forgotten to move forward. I wandered between the graves, my steps slow and deliberate, as though trying to absorb the history that lay beneath my feet. Most of the tombstones were weathered, their engravings barely legible, the names and dates worn away by decades of rain and wind. Some had flowers left by loved ones, others were bare and forgotten. Each stone had a story, but most of those stories had long since been silenced by the passing of years. As I continued deeper into the cemetery, I came upon a small clearing. The grave was different from the others. The headstone was new, its smooth surface untouched by time, the letters still sharp and clear. But what struck me immediately was the name etched into the stone. My name. The same name I had carried all my life, the one I had grown up with, the one I had written on every form and letter. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The engraving was not just my name, it was my full name, including the day, month, and year of my birth. But beneath the date there was something else. The date of death. It was today. The very day I was standing there reading the headstone. My fingers trembled as I reached out, touching the cold stone, as though I could somehow erase the words etched there. But the more I stared, the more the reality of the situation sank in. There, carved into the stone, was my birth date followed by my death date, today's date. The grave was fresh, but the dirt was disturbed only recently, as if someone had just buried it. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I pulled my hand back, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. I looked around, expecting to see someone, maybe a caretaker or a family member tending to a grave, but the cemetery was empty. No one else was around. The sun was dipping lower now, casting an eerie glow over the grave, making it seem as if the stone was glowing with an unnatural light. The chill in the air grew colder, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, but it did little to ease the growing dread that gripped me. Who could have done this? Why would someone carve my name and my birth date into the stone? The idea that this could be some kind of sick joke crossed my mind, but it didn't make sense. Who would go to the trouble of making a new grave, carving the date of death to match the present day? It was as though the grave had been waiting for me. I glanced around again, my mind whirling. There were no footprints in the dirt leading up to the grave, no signs of anyone having been there recently. Everything was still, as if the cemetery itself was holding a secret, and I was the only one who had stumbled upon it. I stepped back, my heart racing, unsure of what to do next. Part of me wanted to run, to escape the oppressive atmosphere that had settled over me, but another part felt rooted to the spot, as if something was compelling me to stay. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees, and I turned to look at the horizon. The sun was almost gone now, leaving the cemetery in a twilight gloom. It was then that I noticed something strange. The other graves, those around me, those in the distance, were all completely still. No movement, no wind disturbing the flowers or the grasses growing around them. But the fresh grave, the one with my name on it, was different. The soil around it seemed to shift slightly, as though something beneath the ground was stirring. I knelt down, my eyes locked on the grave. The feeling of unease was becoming unbearable, but I couldn't tear myself away. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, my breath shallow as I studied the fresh dirt. Slowly, the soil near the headstone began to shift more noticeably, as though something was pushing up from below. My stomach turned, and a voice inside me screamed to leave, but I couldn't move. I had to know what was happening. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the movement stopped. The dirt settled, and everything went quiet again. But the air had changed. It was heavier now, thick with a presence I couldn't explain. I stood up quickly, stumbling backward, my mind racing for answers. Could this be some sort of elaborate prank? A strange coincidence? Or was it something else entirely? A voice, soft but distinct, whispered from somewhere behind me. "It's time." I whipped around, but there was no one there. My heart hammered in my chest, and I felt my legs go weak beneath me. I had to get out of there. I didn't belong here, not with this grave, not with the feeling of being watched. I took one last look at the tombstone, my name still carved into the cold stone, the date of my death etched so clearly beneath it. Without another thought, I turned and fled from the cemetery, my feet pounding on the path as I ran. The air felt oppressive, and the sounds of the world around me seemed muffled, as though I was moving through a thick fog. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town. Breathing heavily, my mind still reeling from what I had just experienced. But even as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left something behind, that the grave was still waiting for me, that the date would one day come to pass. And deep down, I couldn't help but wonder, was this just a coincidence, or had I just witnessed something I was never meant to see? Story 25. The old school stood at the edge of the city, a forgotten relic from a bygone era. Its windows were shattered, and the paint on the walls had peeled away, revealing years of neglect. Despite the heavy air of decay, something about the building called to me. I had spent the last few years exploring abandoned places, always looking for something that told a story, something out of place, and this school seemed to have that eerie charm. I slipped through a broken side entrance, the door creaking as I pushed it open. The inside of the school was just as dilapidated as the outside: broken desks, torn pages scattered across the floor, and dust covering everything. The smell of mildew hung in the air, and the faint echoes of past voices seemed to linger in the hallways. I wandered deeper, my flashlight casting long shadows against the crumbling walls. It wasn't long before I found the classroom. The door had been left ajar, and I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside. The blackboard caught my attention immediately. The green surface, though dusty, was still intact, and the white chalk markings stood out against the dark backdrop. What was strange, though, was that the chalkboard was not covered in random scribbles or lessons left behind. No, it was perfectly written on today's date and my name, James. My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the words for several moments, unsure whether this was a prank or some twisted coincidence. The date on the board matched today, which was unsettling in itself. I was certain no one had been here recently. The place was too far gone for anyone to still use. But there it was, clear as day, my name, written neatly with what appeared to be fresh chalk. I ran my fingers over the chalk markings, but they were dry and powdery, just like they should have been. The sensation of cold air prickled at the back of my neck. I wasn't alone. My breath hitched, and I quickly looked over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be standing behind me. But the room was empty, save for the abandoned desks and chairs. The only sound was the faint rustle of my boots on the old floorboards. I stepped closer to the chalkboard, my mind racing. How could my name be on there? Was it a coincidence? But no, there was no way. No one knew I was here. I hadn't told anyone about my urban exploring trips. I wiped a hand across my forehead, trying to steady my breathing. I needed to investigate further. The classroom itself seemed frozen in time. A few pieces of paper were still hanging on the walls, some half torn, others barely readable. The desks were old-fashioned, the kind that had wooden lids with ink wells still intact. It was as if the school had been abandoned in a hurry, with no sign of anyone having been there in years. But the chalkboard, it was too specific. Someone had to have written that. I moved around the room, looking for any clue that might explain what was happening. My flashlight flicked across the room, and something caught my eye: an old, leather-bound book sitting on a desk near the back of the room. I walked over to it, my curiosity growing with each step. The book was heavy, its cover cracked from age. When I opened it, I found it filled with names, dates, and strange cryptic notes. As I flipped through the pages, I noticed something odd. There, among the scribbles and notes, was a page marked with today's date. My name was written on it, along with a brief note: "Watch the door." My pulse quickened, and I slammed the book shut, a cold sweat beginning to form on my brow. This was no longer a simple urban exploration, it was something much more unsettling. I backed away from the desk, my mind racing. Who had left this book here? Why was my name written on the chalkboard? And why was it in the same notebook? My breath quickened, and I could feel the walls of the room closing in on me. The air seemed to grow thicker, almost as if the building itself was alive, watching me. I turned to leave, but then I froze. The door, which had been ajar when I entered, was now slowly creaking shut. A gust of wind blew through the cracked windows, making the old wood groan in protest. I stood motionless, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't heard the door move, but it was as if something invisible had pushed it closed. I rushed toward the door, my hands trembling as I grabbed the handle. It wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I pulled harder, but the door remained locked, as though something on the other side was preventing me from leaving. I tried to force it open again, but nothing worked. My mind raced. This couldn't be happening. I wasn't locked in here. This was just some old building. But the fear gnawed at me. I turned back toward the chalkboard, my eyes darting to the date and my name once more. Was this some kind of sick joke? Had someone been here before me, setting this up to scare me? The longer I stood there, the more uncomfortable I became. The air felt wrong, thick with an eerie heaviness. It felt like I was being watched by something far beyond the scope of my understanding. Suddenly I heard a faint scratching sound coming from behind me. I whipped around, but the classroom remained empty save for the same abandoned desks and the chalkboard. The sound persisted, growing louder, and I realized it was coming from the chalkboard itself. The chalk was moving. Slowly but deliberately, it began to etch new words into the board, as if an invisible hand was guiding it. I stepped back, my breath caught in my throat. The new words spelled out, "Leave now before it's too late." The chalk stopped moving, leaving the message frozen in time. My legs were shaking, and I could barely breathe. Something was terribly wrong, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to get out, to escape before whatever was in that room came for me. I turned and ran for the door once again, my heart pounding in my chest. This time the handle turned. The door swung open with a groan, and I burst into the hallway, gasping for air. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was out of the building and back in the fresh air. But as I walked away from the school, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. I glanced back, but there was nothing in the distance, just the silhouette of the old building against the setting sun. Still, I couldn't shake the image of the chalkboard, the date, and my name. It felt like I was part of something much larger than myself, something I had stumbled into by mistake. And deep down, I knew that I wasn't meant to know the truth of what had happened inside that school. Story 26. The old asylum loomed in the distance, its decaying stone walls barely holding together after years of abandonment. I had heard the stories, of course, the whispers of the dark past it held, and the strange occurrences reported by others who had dared to enter. But curiosity got the better of me, as it always did, and I found myself standing at the rusted gate, ready to see what lay beyond. The chill of the autumn air made my skin prickle as I pushed the gate open, the creak of metal mingling with the distant sound of wind through the trees. The inside of the asylum was just as eerie as I had imagined. The halls were narrow, with peeling wallpaper and broken windows letting in the dim light of the overcast sky. The floor was covered in dust, disturbed only by my footsteps as I ventured deeper into the building. My flashlight flickered in the darkness, casting long shadows on the walls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water from the ceiling and the sound of my breath echoing in the stillness. I wandered through the maze of corridors, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that covered the floors. The air was musty, thick with the scent of mildew and decay. I passed by old doors, some ajar, others completely off their hinges, revealing empty rooms filled with broken furniture and remnants of a time long gone. The deeper I went, the more I felt the weight of the asylum's history pressing down on me. It was as if the walls themselves were holding on to the memories of the people who had once been confined here, their voices still lingering in the air. Then I reached the main hall. The vast space stretched out before me, its high ceilings disappearing into the darkness above. Broken chandeliers hung from the rafters, their once beautiful crystals now shattered and scattered across the floor. The remnants of old hospital beds and furniture were scattered haphazardly throughout the room, as though left in a hurry. But it wasn't the abandoned furniture that caught my attention, it was something far more unsettling. In the center of the room, there were wheelchairs arranged in a perfect circle. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by the eerie silence of the place. But as I stepped closer, I saw that the wheelchairs were real. They were old, their metal frames rusted, and their cushions torn and worn from years of use. Yet they were arranged so precisely, as if someone had deliberately placed them there. Each wheelchair was positioned at an equal distance from the others, forming a perfect circle in the center of the hall. There was no sign of anyone having been here recently, no footprints in the dust, no movement at all. Yet the scene before me felt alive, as though the wheelchairs were waiting for something or someone. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I couldn't help but take a step back. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I scanned the room, my mind racing with questions. Why would anyone arrange the wheelchairs in such a strange, ritualistic way? It didn't make sense. The idea of it being some kind of sick joke crossed my mind, but the precision of the arrangement made it clear that it wasn't something done on a whim. It felt deliberate, intentional, and that was what unsettled me the most. My gaze lingered on the wheelchairs as a strange feeling washed over me, an odd sensation of being watched. I scanned the rest of the room, expecting to see someone, but the hall was empty. The air seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, drowning out the silence around me. The longer I stood there, the more I felt the presence of something unseen, something that didn't belong. I decided to approach the circle of wheelchairs, my curiosity pushing me forward despite the creeping unease that gnawed at the edges of my mind. As I moved closer, I noticed something strange. Each wheelchair was positioned so that it faced inward, toward the center of the circle. It was as though they were all waiting for something to happen, or someone to sit in them. I shivered at the thought. Who would do this? And why? Suddenly, a loud creak echoed through the room, startling me. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the hall. My breath caught in my throat as I saw nothing but darkness. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the sound of something moving. It could have been the building settling, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I felt my legs grow weak with fear. I quickly turned back toward the wheelchairs, my mind racing. Was it possible that someone was still here? Could they have arranged the wheelchairs recently, and I just hadn't noticed them until now? The thought of someone else being in the asylum with me sent a wave of panic through my chest, but I had no choice but to continue forward. I was too far in to turn back now. As I stood at the edge of the circle, I noticed something else. The dust on the floor was disturbed in a way that suggested someone had recently walked around the wheelchairs. It wasn't a clear trail, but the faintest outline of footsteps was visible, leading in and out of the circle. I bent down to get a closer look, my fingers brushing against the cold, dusty floor. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Someone had been here recently. and they had left these wheelchairs in the exact same formation that I had found them in. A strange noise broke through my thoughts. A soft, muffled sound, like a whisper, seemed to come from the direction of the wheelchairs. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. I couldn't be sure, but it sounded like a voice, faint but unmistakable. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I stood there, straining to hear more. But the sound didn't come again. It was as if the building had swallowed it up. I slowly backed away from the circle, my mind racing with possibilities. Whatever had been here, whatever had arranged those wheelchairs, was not gone. I could feel it in my bones. The asylum had a history, one that I couldn't ignore, and it seemed as though it was still holding on to something I wasn't meant to understand. With a final glance at the circle, I turned and left the room, my footsteps quickening as I made my way toward the exit. The wheelchairs remained in their perfect circle behind me, a silent reminder of whatever had happened in that place. I knew then that I would never be able to forget the image of them, waiting in the darkness. Story 27. The motel was small, tucked away off a winding road that seemed to disappear into the thick trees of the surrounding forest. Its neon sign buzzed faintly in the evening air, casting a sickly green glow over the parking lot. I had been driving for hours and was too tired to care about anything but finding a place to sleep. The office was dark when I entered, but the clerk, a grizzled man with gray stubble and a tired look, handed me a key without much conversation. "Room 5, he muttered, his eyes barely meeting mine. "You're staying the night, right?" I nodded, figuring it was easier than explaining that I just needed a few hours of rest. The air smelled stale in the hallway, the carpeting faded and worn from years of heavy use. As I opened the door to room 5, a musty smell hit me, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. The room was basic, a bed, a nightstand, and a small bathroom tucked in the corner. Nothing about it seemed out of place, except for the slight feeling of unease that settled in my stomach. I tossed my bag on the bed and started to unpack, hoping to get some sleep before continuing my trip. It was then that I noticed something strange. Under the bed, just barely visible, was a small leather-bound journal. Curious, I reached down and pulled it out, the dust on its cover thick and untouched by time. It seemed odd for something like that to be hidden away in such a way, but I shrugged it off and opened the first page. The handwriting was cramped, hurried, and barely legible, but the message was clear. "Don't stay here," it said, the ink smeared in places, as though the writer had been shaking or sweating as they wrote. "Leave now while you can. It's not safe. You won't be the last." A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the words. I turned the page, thinking maybe it was some kind of prank or a message from someone who'd had a bad experience. But the next entry was similar, only more desperate. "They're watching. They always watch. Don't sleep in the bed. Don't lock the door. It won't matter." My hands trembled slightly as I flipped through the pages, each entry growing more frantic and disjointed. The writer's fear was palpable, their handwriting jagged and erratic, as though they were writing in a panic. "The door will open on its own. You won't hear it. It won't matter if you lock it. Just leave, please." I put the journal down, my mind racing. There had to be an explanation. Maybe someone had stayed here for too long and gone a little crazy, but I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in my stomach. The night was growing darker, and the silence in the room seemed to press down on me, thick and suffocating. I placed the journal on the nightstand, but the words from its pages lingered in my mind. I tried to distract myself with the TV, but the screen flickered strangely, showing only static. I turned it off in frustration and got up to check the window. The parking lot was empty, and the trees beyond the motel seemed to stretch on forever, their silhouettes dark against the night sky. The room felt cold, despite the heat from the AC, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I sat back down on the bed, staring at the journal. The entry seemed so real, so urgent. The idea of leaving crossed my mind, but it was late, and the next town was miles away. I couldn't imagine driving through the dark roads again, not after already being so exhausted. A sudden knock at the door startled me, and my heart skipped a beat. I froze for a moment, unsure if I had heard it right. Another knock, more insistent this time. I hesitated, not sure what to do. The room was silent again, except for the sound of my breathing. I stood slowly and approached the door, my hand hovering over the handle. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice trembling despite myself. There was no answer, just the soft, rhythmic tapping of the knocks, almost as though they were coming from somewhere else entirely, somewhere far beyond the door. I took a deep breath and opened it, only to find the hallway empty. My gaze darted down both directions, but there was no one in sight. Just the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above, buzzing like a constant, low warning. I stepped back into the room, locking the door behind me, though a strange part of me didn't think it would make any difference. Sitting back on the bed, I glanced at the journal again. The next entry was dated just a day before mine. "You're in room 5, it read, the ink dark and almost aggressive. "They're coming. They always come for room 5. The last one went missing. You will too if you don't leave." A cold sweat began to bead on my forehead. I looked around the room, suddenly aware of every creak in the walls, every shift in the air. The temperature had dropped, and I could see my breath, faint and misty in the dim light. I grabbed my bag and rushed to the door, but just as I reached for the handle, a loud crash echoed from the hallway. I jerked back, heart pounding in my chest. The sound was unmistakable, like something heavy being dropped to the floor. I backed away from the door, my mind spinning. What was happening? I looked down at the journal again, but the next page was blank. There were no more warnings, no more desperate pleas, just the empty, unsettling page staring back at me. I could hear the air grow heavier, thicker, as though something was just outside, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. I didn't know what to do. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but something held me in place. The thought of stepping out into that empty, silent motel was terrifying, and yet I knew I couldn't stay. The warnings, the knocks, the eerie stillness, they were all signs I couldn't ignore. With shaking hands, I grabbed my things and bolted out of the room, leaving the journal behind. As I rushed past the office, the clerk gave me a blank stare, as though he'd seen this happen countless times before. I didn't stop to ask him any questions. I just ran. The motel behind me felt like a nightmare, one that I hoped I'd never have to relive. But as I drove away into the night, I couldn't help but wonder how many others had found that journal, read the same warnings, and still decided to stay. Story 28. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the desolate landscape as I hiked through the remnants of a ghost town. The area had always fascinated me decades ago. It had been a bustling mining community, but now it was nothing more than crumbling buildings and rusted-out remnants of old machinery. The town's history seemed to linger in the air, and I felt an eerie quiet, like the place was waiting for something to happen. I was nearing the outskirts of the ghost town when I noticed something odd in the distance, a payphone standing alone, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. There was no road nearby, no building to be seen for miles. just a weather-beaten booth, its glass cracked and its faded signage barely legible. I hesitated for a moment, wondering why such a thing would exist here, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked toward it, the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel the only noise for miles. As I drew closer, I noticed the phone booth seemed strangely out of place. It wasn't just the isolation, it was in near perfect condition, especially considering the area's long abandonment. The booth looked almost brand new, standing proudly against the empty landscape. I paused for a moment to look at the small details. The plastic windows were intact, the metal frame was solid, and the phone itself gleamed faintly, as though someone had recently polished it. I had no reason to be interested in it, but something about the payphone intrigued me. It was as if the booth was a relic from another time, a forgotten object that shouldn't have been here. I was about to turn around and continue on my hike when the sound of a ringing phone echoed in the quiet air, sharp and sudden. My heart skipped a beat and I froze. The phone was ringing. I stared at the booth, my breath caught in my throat. There was no one around for miles, no signs of life. It was absurd to think anyone would be calling me here, but the sound of the phone continued, insistent, drawing me closer. A chill ran down my spine, and against my better judgment, I stepped forward. The closer I got, the louder the ring became, as though it was beckoning me. I stood just a few feet from the booth, the ringing filling my ears. I glanced around, half expecting to see someone step out from behind the remnants of an old shack or appear from the trees. But there was nothing. The land was as empty as it had been when I first arrived. My hand hovered over the booth's door, the metal frame cool under my fingertips. I was torn. Part of me wanted to run, to ignore the phone altogether and walk away, but another part, the part that had always been drawn to mysteries, wanted to answer. With a shaky breath, I opened the door and stepped inside the phone booth. The phone continued ringing, the sound vibrating through my chest now. The receiver sat there, resting on its cradle, just waiting. I picked it up, my fingers brushing the cold plastic as I lifted it to my ear. The second my hand touched it, the ringing stopped. The silence that followed felt heavy, oppressive. "Hello?" I said, my voice sounding strange in the stillness. The only response was a faint click, followed by a long pause. Then a voice. It was low and distorted, as though coming through a poor connection, but unmistakably real. "You're not supposed to be here." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was clear, but it had an eerie quality to it, like it was coming from somewhere deep underground. There was something about it, something familiar and yet utterly alien. I couldn't tell if the voice was male or female, but the words echoed in my mind long after they had been spoken. I tried to speak again, but my voice caught in my throat. The voice continued, growing more urgent. "Leave now. Don't come back." The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and the air around me seemed to grow colder, heavier. I wanted to drop the receiver, to run, but I found myself frozen, unable to move. The voice was calm now, but it carried a sense of warning, like the speaker knew something I didn't. "You're not welcome here," the voice repeated, its tone colder than the wind howling outside. Without thinking, I slammed the receiver back into place, my hand trembling as I did so. The booth seemed to come alive with a low hum, the noise of the world around me seeming to fade away as the phone line went dead. For a long moment I stood there, gripping the edge of the booth, trying to steady my breathing. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who had been on the other end? Why had they warned me? I slowly stepped out of the booth, my legs shaky beneath me. The phone had fallen silent again. but the air still felt charged, like something was waiting for me to leave. I glanced back at the booth, half expecting the phone to ring again, but nothing happened. The landscape stretched out before me, just as it had when I arrived. But now it felt different, darker somehow, as though the place had shifted when I wasn't looking. I quickly turned and began walking away, my pace quickening with each step. The thought of turning around to look at the booth again made my stomach churn. The voice, the warning, it was as if I had crossed some invisible boundary, and the land itself was telling me to leave. The ghost town seemed even more deserted now, the air thick with an unsettling silence that pressed in from all sides. As I hiked back toward my car, the weight of the encounter lingered in my mind. The phone call, the voice, the strange feeling that something had just watched me followed me. I couldn't shake the sense that I had been part of something far larger than I could comprehend, something that was far older and more dangerous than I could ever have imagined. I didn't look back once, not even when I reached the edge of the ghost town. The payphone was still out there, waiting for someone else to pick it up, but I wouldn't be that person again. Story 29. The abandoned shopping mall loomed in front of me, a husk of what it once was. The windows were cracked and fogged, the metal security gates rusted in place, and the once vibrant neon signs were now faded to almost nothing. I had always been fascinated by places like this, empty, forgotten, and full of stories. I'd heard rumors about this mall. People said it had been closed overnight for no reason, leaving behind half-finished deals and abandoned inventory. Of course, I had to see it for myself. The air inside the mall was thick with dust and the faint smell of decay. It was eerily silent, the usual hum of a bustling shopping center replaced by a heavy stillness. I walked through the atrium, my footsteps echoing off the marble floors. The overhead lights flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows along the long, empty hallways. The stores were all locked up, some with their windows shattered, others with graffiti scrawled on the walls. But one store caught my eye, a clothing store at the end of the hall, its glass door slightly ajar. I pushed the door open cautiously, the creak of the hinges louder than I had anticipated. Inside, the store was dark, the only light coming from the flickering overhead bulbs. Rows of mannequins stood on pedestals, dressed in the same clothes they had been wearing when the store had been open. But something felt off. They weren't arranged the way I expected. They all seemed to be facing the entrance. Every single one, their glassy eyes trained on the door, almost as if waiting for someone to come inside. A chill ran down my spine, and I hesitated in the doorway, my heart beginning to race. I knew it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the mannequins were watching me. I stepped forward cautiously, my eyes never leaving their stiff forms. The store was quiet, but there was an odd stillness to the air, as though the mannequins had been frozen in place just for me. I reached out to touch one, my fingers brushing against the smooth surface of the mannequin's face. It felt cold, unnaturally so, and I quickly pulled my hand away. As I moved deeper into the store, I couldn't shake the feeling of being surrounded. The mannequins seemed to stand even more rigidly now, their heads turning ever so slightly toward me as I walked by. I stopped in front of one of them, a mannequin dressed in a winter coat. I noticed something strange, its eyes. They weren't the dull, lifeless eyes I had seen in the others. These were different. They seemed almost too real. I blinked and stepped back, my breath catching in my throat. I forced myself to keep moving, to ignore the creeping feeling that I was not alone in the store. I moved to the back of the store, where a few mannequins were positioned near the fitting rooms. The further I walked, the more unsettling the scene became. Each mannequin had been placed in such a way that they all seemed to be positioned for one thing: to face the entrance. It was as though they had been arranged for my arrival, waiting for me to step inside. I turned toward the back of the store, and that's when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, behind a row of mannequins, was a mirror. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it seemed to draw me in. I approached the mirror cautiously, my reflection flickering in the glass. The room behind me appeared perfectly normal, nothing out of place. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the reflection, I saw a mannequin move. Not the slow, stiff movements I had come to expect, but an actual shift in arm jerking, a head turning just slightly to the side. My heart skipped a beat, and I turned around quickly, but there was nothing there. The mannequin was frozen again, facing the entrance like the others. My pulse quickened, my breath shallow as I backed away from the mirror. Was I imagining things, or was something truly wrong in this place? I turned toward the door, ready to leave, but something made me stop. A sound, faint but distinct, came from behind me, a soft rustling. It was as though someone or something had moved in the back of the store. I spun around, my eyes scanning the rows of mannequins. Nothing. Just the same silent, eerie figures, all facing the door. But the air felt heavier now, as if the mall itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I took a step toward the exit, but just as I reached for the door handle, I froze. A figure was standing at the far end of the store. It was hard to make out at first, just a silhouette against the dim light, but as I stared, my heart stopped. It was a mannequin, but it was no longer standing still. It was moving toward me, its stiff limbs jerking as it walked with an unnerving, mechanical precision. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Could it be a person in disguise, playing a prank? Or was it really a mannequin moving on its own? I couldn't take it anymore. Panic surged through me as I yanked the door open and bolted out of the store. My heart was pounding in my chest as I ran through the mall, not daring to look back. I heard nothing but the pounding of my feet on the tiles and the faint rustling of the mannequins behind me. I didn't stop until I was outside, the fresh air hitting my face like a slap. Breathing heavily, I looked back at the mall. It stood in its decaying silence, the empty windows staring back at me. I felt the weight of the place pressing on my chest, the unsettling sensation that something wasn't right, that I had interrupted something that was never meant to be disturbed. I didn't know what I had seen inside that store, whether it had been a trick of the mind or something more sinister. But one thing was clear: I would never go back to that mall again. The mannequins had turned toward me for a reason, and I had no intention of finding out what that reason was. Story 30. I had walked this street countless times, past the same houses, the same sidewalks, and the same old, boarded-up house at the end of the block. It was a small, dilapidated building, its once bright white paint now faded and chipped, windows completely covered with wooden planks. No one had lived there for as long as I could remember, and no one seemed to care about it. It had become just another forgotten structure, blending into the background of my daily routine. On this particular evening, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the neighborhood. I had been running errands and was heading home when I noticed something odd. As I walked past the boarded-up house, I heard a sound, a soft, rhythmic knocking. At first, I thought it was just the wind pushing against the boards, or perhaps a tree branch tapping at the window. But then the sound came again, louder this time, unmistakable knock, knock, knock. I stopped in my tracks, my heart rate picking up. The knocking continued, each tap followed by a brief silence, as if waiting for a response. There was something strange about it. It didn't sound like it was coming from the outside, but from inside the house itself. I looked around, but there was no one in sight. The street was eerily quiet, and the soft twilight air felt still, as if the whole world had paused to listen. Curiosity, tinged with unease, tugged at me. I walked up to the front of the house, standing just a few feet from the boarded windows. I peered through a gap between two of the planks, the wood creaking as I tried to get a better view inside. The dim light from the setting sun barely illuminated the dark interior, but enough for me to make out the faint outline of empty rooms. There was nothing in there, no furniture, no decoration, just bare, dust-covered floors. Yet the knocking persisted. I moved my head closer to the gap, pressing my eye against the wood. My breath fogged up the small opening, but I still couldn't make out any figures inside. The knocking continued, coming from somewhere deep within the house. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Who could be inside? The house had been abandoned for years, or so I thought. It didn't make sense. I took a step back, trying to assess the situation. The house had been sealed up for as long as I could remember. No one had lived there, and it was in such poor condition that it was unlikely anyone would even try to break in. I had never seen any signs of activity in or around the house, no lights, no sounds, no indication that anyone was there. Yet, here I was, hearing knocks from inside, as if someone or something was waiting for someone to hear them. I glanced down the street, making sure I wasn't being watched. My curiosity was growing, but so was the unease in my chest. I couldn't just leave without knowing what was happening inside. Slowly, I walked around the side of the house, my shoes crunching against the gravel. The back of the house was even more decayed, with ivy creeping up the brick and the rear door barely hanging on its hinges. There was another gap between the boards at the back of the house, and I pressed my face up to it, holding my breath. I could hear the knocking more clearly now, knock, 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 but still saw nothing inside. It was as if the house itself was breathing, pulsing with the sound of a presence, though there were no signs of life. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe someone had been squatting there, hiding in the shadows. But who would stay in such a place? I stood there for a few moments, listening. The knocking was louder now, almost rhythmic, as if it were calling me. I felt a strange compulsion to answer it, to acknowledge whatever was making the sound. But fear held me back. What if it was a trap? What if there was someone or something waiting for me to make the wrong move? Finally, I pulled myself away from the gap and stepped back. My eyes scanned the street again, but nothing had changed. The house was still abandoned, empty and silent except for that persistent knocking. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just been witness to something impossible, something that shouldn't have been. But I had to know. I had to see it for myself. I looked around for any way to get inside. The back door was too far gone to be useful, but there was a small window near the front of the house, just beneath the boarded-up panels. I crouched down to inspect it. To my surprise, one of the boards was loose. It hadn't been nailed down properly, and with a little effort, I was able to pull it away. I hesitated, staring at the darkened interior, wondering if I was making a mistake. But curiosity won out, and I slipped through the small opening, landing quietly on the floor inside. The air was musty, thick with the scent of decay and neglect. My eyes struggled to adjust to the dim light as I slowly stood up. The house was as empty as I had seen from the outside, empty rooms, dust-covered floors, and faded wallpaper peeling off the walls. The knocking had stopped, leaving only silence in its wake. I took a few cautious steps, my senses on high alert. The house creaked under my weight, the old beams groaning in protest. I reached the center of the room and paused, listening. But there was nothing, no knocking, no sounds of movement. Just silence, deep and unsettling. I could feel the walls pressing in around me, as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for me to leave. And then, as I turned to leave, I heard it again. The knock, 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 this time coming from behind me. I spun around, but the room was still empty. My heart raced in my chest, and I bolted for the exit. I didn't look back as I climbed out through the window and ran down the street, not stopping until I was safely home. I never went near the house again. The next time I walked past, it was as empty as ever. No knocking, no sound, just the same old house, abandoned and forgotten. But I knew what I had heard, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still waiting inside, hidden in the silence.